Hi, everybody. It's so nice to see people in person and to welcome all of you who are with us online. We had a huge registration. I am Sarah Rosen-Mortel, and I have the great honor of being the president of the Urban Institute, and also to be the first to welcome everyone today to a content-packed day of information and dialogue about cash assistance for children, where we're going to explore both research and policy and where it may go in the future. But first, my assignment is housekeeping. So today's event is hybrid. We are thrilled to have you wherever you are, watching now or later. This will be recorded and the event is posted online on the event page, Urban Institute, in the coming days, where you'll also find the biographies for all of our speakers. Live captions are enabled for those of you who are watching online, but you are welcome to turn them off if you prefer not to have them on, and just toggle below. Virtual attendees can also join the conversation by submitting questions using the form that is being shared in the chat, I think, right now. And those of you who are in the room, you can find around here the QR code. We thought there were going to be tables, but we had more people in person, but I assume the QR code is somewhere around the room that you can use for submitting your questions. And if not, we can, yeah, great. This event is the capstone of a multi-year project, and I want to add, first of all, my special thanks to some of the key partners in this work who are here with us today. First, Sam Gelb, president of the Doris Duke Foundation, who you will hear from shortly. As you will all learn, Sam is a big and deep thinker. He's the thinker that philanthropy needs right now, and he always makes me think twice as hard as almost anyone else I engage with. And he also almost always makes me consult my thesaurus. So I think you'll all see a little of that. We also want to say our appreciation to Jody Hill-Lilly, who's the program director for child well-being at the Doris Duke Foundation, and Megan Prunty, who's senior advisor to the foundation and a great partner and longtime collaborator. Thanks for being here. And then we are so pleased to have been working with the Berkeley Opportunity Lab, or OLAB as it's known. Hillary Hoynes, faculty director, and Joe Broadus, program manager, have been our partners through this work. So now I get to say a few words about today's subject. And let me start by noting that people across the ideological spectrum appreciate that children who grow up poor face diminished prospects for their own long-term development and economic success. And we'll hear later from Director Gruber that income is not the only determinant of that child's prospects. But when children don't get a strong start, we all pay the price for their lost potential, and sometimes for increased public costs as well. This initiative began several years ago when there seemed to be growing support for the idea of unconditional and unrestricted cash assistance to low-income families with children, so as to allow us all to avoid those costs and give children the opportunity to thrive. The federal government had expanded child tax credits in 2021 to the lowest income families, and states began enacting child tax credits, and local guaranteed income pilots were taking off around the country. Urban is proud that we got to do important work on the mechanics of how to implement a child allowance, and also tried to bring people together to talk about this model, cross-ideological dialogue that was one of the core purposes of this project. Supporters of cash assistance cited research on how cash reduces child poverty and improves outcomes among recipients, both in the short and long term, as well as reducing racial and economic disparities. Importantly, there was also a burgeoning conversation between left and at least some on the right, including Senator Mitt Romney and the Niskanen Center, about the appeal of cash assistance as a potential new model for supporting families with children. Some of us thought that moment might be a turning point, but it didn't prove to be so. The child tax credit expansion and monthly delivery were allowed to expire at the end of 2021 as a pandemic effort only, with the credit returning to its previous level and method of delivery. While some conservatives continued to advance arguments for expanding the tax credit, these proposals were often paired with changes and reductions in other supports, And if truth is told, many progressives feared that the consolidation would simply lead to fewer resources for struggling families. And so our dialogue, once again, was stalemated. In 2024, both Vice President Harris and VP Vance spoke about expansions to the child tax credit. But still, we have insufficient trust to begin a serious conversation about reimagining a safety net that would work effectively to expand opportunities for poor children. So today, we're looking back at that moment of 2021 for what we can learn about what works to improve outcomes for children. And we also are contending with a few newer studies, and you'll hear about some of them today, like the Baby First Years study and research out at the University of Michigan. They suggest that while cash immediately reduces poverty and financial hardship, cash has not demonstrated, at least to date, that it has a robust downstream effect on child development. Scholars debate whether these findings will change when we follow children for longer periods or whether the timing of the studies affected their results. But at very least, the debate suggests that we have much to learn still about how cash can affect child well-being. In other words, evidence matters. Meanwhile, Congress did modestly expand the child tax credit earlier this year as part of the tax reconciliation bill. Those changes flowed overwhelmingly to those with somewhat higher incomes, and the bill also cut health and food assistance programs for low-income families, leaving those families with fewer resources on net, according to both CBO and Urban Institute estimates. So where do we go from here? Today, we're going to hear more about what states have done to support families and children, hearing from Maryland Governor Moore and Utah's Tracy Gruber, who is Executive Director of the Department of Health and Human Services, working under Governor Spencer Cox. As is often the case, diverse state approaches provide a proving ground and may be our best sources of new learning in the period ahead. And maybe, just maybe, states that sometimes are a more pragmatic venue for innovation will show us a way forward from our stalemate on how the best to support our poor children. I'm excited to get into this conversation, but first I want to turn this over to my friend Sam Gill, President and CEO of the Doris Duke Foundation, who's playing a really important role in the philanthropic community in the defense of science and trust in institutions. And we're really lucky to have a chance to get to hear from him. Get out your thesaurus, Sam.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Sarah. I hope I can live up to it and confound you all with the words I use. And of course, thanks to you, Sarah, for your incredible leadership of Urban Institute and your leadership of this work. I think this project exemplifies the kind of innovative spirit that you and Urban are bringing to social policy, and clearly of which our country is in dire need. I also want to thank Elaine Mogg, Hillary Hoynes, and the entire Urban and Berkeley OLAB teams for conceiving of and leading this remarkable multi-year research effort at Doris Duke Foundation. We're absolutely proud and honored to be associated with this work. And thanks to everyone who's here today and joining from around the country for this important conversation, especially Governor Moore, Director Gruber, for being here to engage in this conversation with all of us. At Doris Duke, this work is led by our great child well-being national program team, and it's my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome our brand new director of child well-being, Jody Hill-Lilly. Jody has been at the foundation for just a handful of weeks, but those of you who know her won't be surprised to know that she's already injecting a fresh energy into all that we do. The team also includes the wonderful Liz Weiner and Rosie Vasson. Thanks to them for their work and help. Briefly, a word about the foundation. Doris Duke Foundation is focused on building a more creative, equitable, and sustainable future. We pursue this mission by advancing important ideas in the areas of arts and culture, nature, and health and well-being, and we pursue this mission with the same spirit and passion that Doris Duke displayed throughout her life. In her own philanthropy, Duke dared to be different, dared to think differently, dared to act differently. And these are times in which we really need to dare to think differently. What do I mean by that? Let me start with some context. Doris Duke Foundation support for the Cash Assistance in Children Initiative is part of a larger effort to help build a prevention-oriented child welfare system. Through a series of multi-year investments, we are seeking to demonstrate the potential for the child welfare and human services systems to improve child and family outcomes by identifying and supporting vulnerable children and families before their acute needs turn into crisis. So concretely, this means, for example, helping families access counseling services, or making sure they can pay an electric bill before their power's cut, or fix their car before they're unable to work or they might lose a job. Our flagship initiative is the Opportunities for Prevention and Transformation Initiative, or Opt-in for Families. And Opt-in is a multi-site demonstration in Oregon, Kentucky, the District of Columbia, and South Carolina that is building and testing an end-to-end preventative response. A critical hypothesis underpinning this work is that most of what the child welfare system is seeking to address are the consequences of material inequality. In other words, that the problem is not individual vice, but a society in which material privation unduly stresses families. And a corollary of this belief is the idea that the answer to these problems is not to surveil, to coerce, or to punish parents and children, but to instead ameliorate the underlying material conditions that can put families on the path to crisis, including through the provision of cash assistance. But rather than speaking about these specific policy topics, I'd actually like to offer some reflections on some of the basic assumptions underpinning the important, remarkable work of the Cash Assistance for Children initiative. And by basic assumptions, I don't mean microeconomic assumptions, but even more fundamental assumptions about what kind of thing valid knowledge even is. So get ready for your history lesson. The underlying validity of all this work, of all evidence-based research, is actually really based on a fundamental break that occurred in Western Europe over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. And the break wasn't actually about scholarship itself. For over 1,000 years prior to this period, the basis and parameters for really, really good scholarship were scriptural and ecclesiastic. And these constraints included not just questions of method, so how you go about finding the truth, but also specific objective facts about the world. That's what revealed truth or revelation is. And the billions of people of faith across the world today speak to the enduring value of religions as essential ethical doctrines. When it comes to moral truth, faith remains a vital and enduring fountainhead. But when it comes to understanding our natural world, human societies found that a different set of methods perform significantly better in predicting natural phenomena. This is important because prediction is the essence of what social scientists call causal inference. What you can predict, you can understand. What you can predict, you can control. So what were these new approaches? They represented a range of practices that served as the prototypes for what today we learn in school, for some of us centuries ago, as the scientific method, which combines an approach to reasoning that is rooted in purely rational processes with a fundamental commitment to empirical observation, to what actually happened in the world. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries kicked off the rapid acceleration in increasingly accurate knowledge about our natural world, and a concomitant acceleration in the material development of our societies. So here's one example. It took all of human history, until the year 1804 for our population to grow to 1 billion people. It has taken less than 225 years to add another 7 billion people to that total. Here's another, just for fun. Today, the average person on Earth, by themselves, annually consumes the same amount of energy as that expended by 60 people working day and night the entire year. So we're living in a world that has been radically remade by the growth of an activity called scientific research. And what that activity does with unparalleled success is produce something called an objective fact, something that is true independent of our opinions or our experience. This requires an enormous technically competent class whose status and merit is ideally a product of verified mastery over a body of knowledge and a track record of success. And this is not just pragmatically necessary, but also morally necessary in a democratic society. The defining characteristic of democratic government is that the power to rule derives from us, the people, not from some divine writ or other supernatural source. And while we may still look to religious authorities for eternal salvation, on earth it is reason that can justify the application of power to serve our common ends. In our modern democracy, the way that we express this idea that only reason can legitimate power is through institutions comprised of experts who apply scientific and rational methods to produce the goods and services that we require. And these experts, whether they're civil servants in government or managers in a private corporation, are loyal to a body of authoritative knowledge and also to an ethical doctrine. And this loyalty extends beyond the boundaries of their respective institutions. In other words, lawyers are bound to have a satisfactory knowledge of the law and to observe a set of fiduciary obligations on behalf of their clients. Doctors must understand medicine and also abide by the Hippocratic Oath. Even corporate leaders apply managerial expertise and also adhere to ethical codes that cover conduct beyond the clear boundaries of law or organizational policy. This dual loyalty to knowledge and to a public democratic morality is what it means to be a professional in our society. The reason I'm delving so deeply into this kind of esoteric theory or history about how scientific knowledge has evolved into the modern apparatus of democratic governance is because right now, the idea that our society should be managed by elite technical experts is being profoundly questioned across the society. The most visible examples have been debates about certain federal bureaucracies, but there have also been questions raised about private institutions, including and especially universities. How we got to this state of affairs requires more time than I have today, and my guess is there are a lot of different and worthy opinions just in this audience. Maybe we'll hear from some of those opinions later. But at least a part of the story is that for a variety of reasons, trust in expert-driven institutions has really cratered in our society over the past quarter century. But I think if we make this discussion just about the social forces propelling this questioning of expertise, we'll leave out some observations that I expect are actually quite pertinent to many of us assembled here today. First, I think a group of extremely well-intentioned, thoughtful, and generally studious researchers and advocates have been guilty of expounding a critique of objectivity and objective fact that has a lot of merit, but has also had some unfortunate and perhaps unintended consequences. In building on a body of thought from the middle of the 20th century, this critique has noted first, that some knowledge that purports to be objective is actually socially constructed. And second, that presenting what are social constructions as objective knowledge can be a tool for sheltering what are political views at the end of the day from public debate. So in other words, this line of argument says that presenting, quote unquote facts about things like race and gender short circuits our ability to challenge pernicious assumptions about race and gender. Because you can argue about social propositions, but you can't argue about objective facts. And while this critique has a lot to teach us, it is sometimes invoked to warrant the claim that not only is there no such thing as objectivity, period, but that the whole enterprise of objective knowledge is hopelessly contaminated by legacies of the way that these ideas have been used in the past. Second, in domains of translational research, so what a think tank does, I think we have at times confused the role of social science. The point of social science research is not to quote unquote prove that we should expand, for example, the child tax credit in some way, or to prove that direct cash assistance is a preferable way to secure life outcomes for children and families. The role of this research is first to subject the scientific method questions of what the causes of adverse social outcomes are. And second, to interpret rational, objective facts about these causes in the formulation of solutions, because it actually matters that we know what the problem is and that we solve the actual problem. This process of formulation is inevitably an uncertain endeavor and includes a mix of objective facts and subjective judgments. Often the best solution combines some evidentiary basis with a set of moral convictions. So what's the upshot for all of us who are here today of these reflections? Vulnerable children and families are doing better now than they have for the whole of human history. But of course, the most vulnerable are not doing well enough. And the amount of misery our wealthy society tolerates is a grievous and festering moral injury that we must respond to. And the fact that social factors such as race continue to predict with tragic accuracy who will be among the worst off remains a sinister and haunting legacy of our worst human impulses and faults. But over the last 150 years, our overall ability to address the worst kinds of human vulnerability has been a civilizational miracle. That miracle is not the product of one study or one body of work. It's the product of a system of democratic governance that insists that social policy should, in the first instance, be based on scholarly and scientific study. Right now, the legitimacy and basic integrity of that system is struggling to secure its existence. The outcome of this debate, whether reason and expertise will continue to be the basis of how we govern a democracy in the modern age, will swamp the impact of any one paper on a given policy. Everyone in this room is either in the business of producing objective facts about social policy, that is, the business of producing evidence, or is committed to the principle that reasoned interpretation of this evidence should guide the formulation of social policy. That makes you all responsible for how this debate turns out. And there are some simple things that we can do to help ensure we continue to live in a system that values rule by reason. We can point out that treating social constructions as objective does not mean objectivity is itself an illusion. Indeed, we can insist that loyalty to facts means surfacing and scrutinizing those places where objectivity is just used as a guise for oppression. We can also point out that expanding the range of valid knowledge, such as through the invocation of lived experience, is a commitment to the power of objectivity, not its repudiation. We can ensure that our embrace of particular policy solutions, such as expansion or modification to the child tax credit, is subsequent to evidence, not a doctrinal conviction that is prior to what social science tells us. And we can change our minds about the right solutions when science and reason tell us that our preferred approaches haven't worked in the way that we wanted them to. Most of all, we can stand up for the value of expertise outside of and independent from our particular and varying ideological beliefs. We can insist that we would prefer to live in a society that delegates the stewardship of the public interest to experts, even though we know that sometimes the application of expertise will lead to results that certain of us may not like. And while you all may be on the front lines of this debate, you're not there alone. Every professional in every sector of society is standing beside you. We're in a moment in our society when it has become commonplace to hear that there are some values in a democracy that supersede party or ideology. The primacy of reason, of evidence, of facts, and legitimating self-government is one of those values. The Urban Institute, this project, represent the quintessence of this value. But it is up to all of us to make sure that our loyalty to this higher value is not just an empty sentiment we uttered in the twilight of a 250-year democratic experiment, but a conviction we made real in inaugurating our democracy's next chapter. Thank you for all the great work that you do. Thanks very much. And Sarah, back to you.
All right, well, he makes you think, right? So now we have someone else who's going to make us think. I have a great pleasure of introducing Tracy Gruber, who's the Executive Director of Utah's Department of Health and Human Services. Director Gruber has spent most of her career in either the nonprofit or public sector working for children and families in Utah to ensure that every Utahn, I never know if I pronounced that right, has the opportunity to realize their hopes and dreams. She was a senior advisor to the state's Intergenerational Poverty Initiative, which was led by then Lieutenant Governor Spencer Cox, and she worked to promote families and policies that yielded measurable, positive results for children and families. Utah identified through this initiative that among the children experiencing intergenerational poverty, 1 in 5 of them were victims of child abuse and neglect, leading the state to change its child welfare system to keep children in families when it's safe to do so through in-home and preventative services, being led by evidence. Since the Intergenerational Poverty Initiative began, Utah's child poverty rate has been cut almost in half, from 15% in 2012 to 8.6% in 2024, according to the census. And during the same time, an important source of evidence, Utah has been moved from 11th in the nation to 4th in the nation for overall child well-being, according to the Casey Foundation's Kids Count data book. Utah, under the leadership of Governor Cox, has taken various approaches to improving the well-being of its children, from enacting and expanding a non-refundable state child tax credit for families with young children to increasing the funding for full-day kindergarten. The governor has also been an outspoken leader pushing for restrictions on social media for children and having families disconnect from their phones, and having people with different ideas come together with his national campaign to disagree better. Central to all of these efforts has been Director Gruber's work leading Utah's Department of HHS, the state's largest department, which includes children and family services, maternal and child health services, juvenile justice and youth services, Medicaid and CHIP, just to name a few. Prior to becoming the director, she was the director of Utah's Office of Child Care, and previously she graduated from University of Wisconsin and Madison, go Badgers, and Chicago Kent School of Law. So we're really pleased to be joined by Director Gruber, and I look forward to learning from her what we can draw as lessons for the federal and state policy. So, Director, and there she is.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that really warm introduction. It's really an honor and a privilege just personally to be here at the Urban Institute, just an organization that I truly respect for its research and creating the Policy to Prosperity pipeline. And I'm really excited to share more about Utah's perspective and approach to economic security for families. This is an incredibly important conversation when we look at how much money is being spent on safety net programs. 114 trillion is the number that I saw recently for 114 programs, and we owe it to our families to know whether or not those investments are working, and even more to have the courage courage to say to stop when they don't. My role here today is really to talk about Utah specifically and our success. But I'm just going to start a little bit with my personal why and why I think it's so incredibly important and what drives me every day. When you think about our department, I was exhausted at the list of what's in our department, but the convergence of all of those things are so incredibly important. I grew up in 60035. That's a zip code in the Chicago suburban area, and it was a very socioeconomically diverse area. It is on the North Shore, if anybody knows about that. It has a reputation as being extremely wealthy, but 60035 was socioeconomically diverse. There was a military base there. There was ethnic and racial diversity, and we had great schools, safe streets, safe communities, strong social capital, and that led to a lot of my classmates graduating from high school, going on to college, and we really just epitomize what it means to create opportunity and pathways of opportunity. And so I find myself in Utah, where we emphasize two very core values that have driven our success. One is family and the focus on family and the nurturing of family, policies to support families, and of course, social capital that connects people in their communities, and not just people of the same economic class, but converging different economic classes of people together, like the community I grew up in. And in addition to that, Utah focuses on opportunities from the start, really driving local solutions, providing the tools to success, not just the financial support, and recognizing that it is not the sole responsibility of government to be able to ensure that there are opportunities. So what about Utah? The governor a couple years ago in his State of the State address had the theme of Utah is weird. Well, if Utah is weird, every state should be weird too. We rank #1 overall in U.S. News and World Report. We're the #1 state for seniors, 3rd best economy, 3rd best well-trained and well-educated, #2 for education. The list goes on. And as Sarah mentioned, our poverty rate is, if it's not the lowest in the country, it is among the lowest. 8.5% in Utah versus 12.5%. We've reduced child poverty by 43% since 2012. And we are very much focused on those predictors of upward mobility, of social economic stability through upward mobility and social capital. But not all is happy in Happy Valley, a name that is frequently used for Utah. We do see that economic opportunity differs by geography. I think that's not a surprise. And then we're also not insulated from some of the other issues that are confronting our youth, from the youth mental health crisis. We also have a very high suicide rate amongst our youth. We are the 9th most expensive housing market. We have homelessness, and we are impacted by the drug crisis. So how do we approach these things? Well, Sarah spent some time talking about the Intergenerational Poverty Initiative, which was a state law that was passed in 2012 unanimously, which might be a surprise to some of you, by the Utah legislature, focused on those values of opportunity. And we used data and matched it across state government and court systems and wherever we could get our hands on to understand what was going on with the youth who were experiencing intergenerational poverty, because the focus was on kids, measurably reducing the incidence of poverty amongst Utah's children. We looked at our data across 4 domains, critical domains of opportunity: early childhood development, health, economic stability, and education. And so that started in 2012. You heard about the poverty rate dropping. It also helped change the narrative about poverty, that the people who are experiencing intergenerational poverty are not simply having a crisis in their life at one time. They grew up in challenging circumstances. They've experienced trauma in their lives. We know what that means for brain development. And so we helped get people to the table to really focus on this. And we also really focused on getting resources to local communities to come up with local solutions. And we're not stopping at what we did on intergenerational poverty. There's a $6 million 3-year pilot invested in benefits cliffs, and not what you would think is the typical research on benefits cliffs, but going back to these families, getting them prepared for the moment when there is a cliff. We all know that. Eventually, those benefits are going to run out, and we want our families to be prepared for that moment with some financial education, and also focusing on the family, those family-friendly workplace strategies, from family leave policies, not just when you have a newborn child, but adoption and foster care, flexible work arrangements, and of course, child tax credits. And we're continuing to measure, look at data and measure outcomes through integrating data. States can certainly, Utah is unique, every state is unique. I think that there's a few things states could do that want to move in this direction. One is to remove silos at the state level. We can't do anything about the silos at the federal level. Our governor and our legislature merged the Department of Health and the Department of Human Services in the middle of the pandemic, which was exciting. But it helps to remove those silos at the state level. You need to define outcomes, not outputs, and put all of your money and your energy, your grants, your contracts to those outcomes. You need to talk to the federal partners about allowing the braiding of the funding, because these populations are moving through programs, and if you can braid the funding and serve them collectively, that would be amazing. And also integrating the data, so you truly know what's going on with your population, and you're not making assumptions. We're not assuming that what's going on with our population in Utah is the same as what's going on in the population where I grew up in the Chicago area. So those are just some. And then, of course, the non-traditional pathway to economic mobility, that social connectedness, the integrating of economic classes together, to learn together, to worship together, to do all of the things that makes a strong community, makes for really strong impacts. The last thing that I'll just mention is that I know that there's a question about where should we go next on research. I think the cash assistance question is a really interesting one. Does cash assistance work the same for people who are in situational poverty as intergenerational poverty? And does the benefit last long term, which I think was something that was mentioned. I also would be curious to know if it matters, if place matters. If you get that cash assistance in one community versus another, are you going to see the same benefits when there's strong education, lots of employment? Is that outcome going to be the same or different? And then, of course, the place-based initiatives. Which ones are actually working? They cost a lot of money if they're done well, and you need to be able to demonstrate the return when you engage in those place-based initiatives, or you can't get the investment. So with that, it's just a real honor and a privilege to share just a little bit about what's going on in Utah and what makes our state so special, and I'm looking forward to talking more about it. Thank you.
Am I on? So I love the fact that you already started to answer some of the questions we're going to talk about here, but I get to dig in a little more deeply. And let me just say, I also love that you started with your why and the community that you grew up in. Because I grew up in a community on the Upper West Side of Manhattan that was part of an urban renewal district in the 60s with some of the most distressed building stock and neighborhoods, and also some unique geography of very affluent neighborhoods right adjacent. And the mixing bowl of economic community in my local public school, I often credit to why I'm in this job today. So thank you for sharing that story. Yeah. I think there's a lot to probe there. I guess I would want to start with your discussion about different approaches to reducing poverty. You gave us a whole bunch of different strategies and questions you want to know more about. But there is a difference in the approach that Utah has taken to Maryland that we'll hear about a little bit more. And to date, you've asked a lot of good questions about cash, but cash is not as central. You do have a tax credit. It's not refundable.
Yes, right.
It's not as central as it is. And can you talk a little bit about why that is and what the sort of premise is and why that's the sort of value set in the state?
Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I think that you can't talk about Utah without recognizing that it has a predominant faith that has very strong values that influences the policies that are implemented in our state. And so I think that as part of that, I mean, I'll just say that, like, if you think about higher ed, Utah has the lowest uptake in student loans, I think, in any state in the nation. So there's a very strong feeling of cash isn't always the answer, and you need to think about who you are as an individual and build that piece of your life. And so a lot of our policies are around those types of solutions. So not necessarily giving cash, but making sure that the structure is there, the opportunities are there for you to be able to, if you're starting in early childhood. We don't have universal pre-K, but you mentioned full day kindergarten, supporting families and supporting early childhood development, making sure our schools are strong. We got a lot of flack for not investing as much money in schools, but our educational system's ranked #2 in the nation, which I think is a surprise for people. And so not focusing on what some people would characterize as a hand out, but a hand up, and figuring out what those policies should be of everybody coming together to figure out to put those strategies in place, and what are the key elements that will lead to that increased opportunity.
At Urban, we run an initiative you may have heard about, Upward Mobility from Poverty. You founded on the work of the U.S. Partnership for Mobility from Poverty. And it formulated a framework or an approach that also, so what is our goal? Our goal is, yes, of course, economic success, that children have a better future over time. But we also talked about two other related concepts, one of which was autonomy and some control over your own life. And the other was a sense of belonging and being valued in your community. And I'm curious, when we've, and I was an observer of that process of leaders, they talked about those values because they appealed across different faith and different ideological values. How do you think those concepts of autonomy and sort of sense of dignity in one's life affect the approach that you've taken?
Oh, I think I mean, I don't know that much about the science of hope, but I think the science of hope speaks to that. Like, you've got to respect people's ability to make their own choices. And sometimes those choices are going to be good and sometimes they're going to be bad. And having systems that allow for choice is incredibly important, and to not have all the specifics laid out for you. For me personally, just respecting people as individuals and recognizing people have really challenging lives, particularly the people who we serve in our department, and recognizing that we should be a pathway for them to make choices and provide them with support to make those choices is incredibly important. And then, of course, social connection, your community, who you are spending time with and feeling connected, and social capital can be very good. It can also be very bad. And so having those communities where there's opportunities for positive social capital, and again, I mean, I think just going back to, because faith is so central in Utah, you know, the way that the church is structured is by having everybody together coming to worship. And I think that allows you to have perspective on other people's lives and get proximate to the challenges they might face and come together as a community to address those challenges and still feel that connection.
you've made me curious about something we'll go into another day, which is there increasingly now even faith communities are more homogeneous than they have been, and I'd be curious to understand that better. But that leads me to a question about the state. Many of us tend to think of Utah as a more homogeneous state compared to many others in the country. And yet you've been, or maybe because, I don't know, you have been able to make this significant progress on your poverty rate. And I'm curious what you think the big whys are that you were able to make progress. Do you have the same challenges of places of deep concentrated poverty, even with and am I right to think of the state still as a more homogeneous population?
Well, you're absolutely right that it still is homogeneous. It is changing and changing very quickly. And so there are more racial and ethnic minorities in the state growing at a rapid pace, and that is changing the demographics pretty dramatically. And we're also losing our status of having the highest birth rate. So things are changing pretty quickly. Remind me of the question again.
Well, it was just, why do you think you were successful?
Why were we successful?
Making
well, I think one of the
progress?
primary reasons is because it was not just a government solution. We had our faith-based communities involved. We had nonprofits. We had business, all focused, and it was not it wasn't a silver bullet strategy. And so the narrative helped bring everybody to the table. It helped everybody realize that if you're going to address intergenerational poverty for children, you can't just find one thing. You've got to start in early childhood, look at those 4 areas of child well-being. And I give props to the Casey Foundation. I was one of their in one of their leadership institutes, and we really modeled it based on those areas of child well-being that we are proven that if you invest in those areas, you are going to be able to see great progress and great outcomes for kids. And I think that's why, and the state made big investments in early childhood, massive investments in education that I think we're seeing pay dividends at this point.
So you're at the Urban Institute, so I need to ask you to talk about evidence and research and what's the ecosystem like, and where you've already answered one of my questions, which are what are some of the places you think we could be doing more work. Foundations be listening. But what is your sense of the value and how does government do a good job or a less good job? What helps government to be able to work closely with evidence-based insights?
Well, I feel very lucky that Utah works very intentionally on data and data collection and data sharing with the balance with privacy. We are very focused on making sure that that data is protected. So I have a lot of conversations about using aggregated data. We absolutely have to be focused on that. And I'm not an academic researcher. I'm more of a policy researcher, so statistical significance kind of eludes me. But at a lot of these questions, you don't need that level of rigor to understand what's going on with our populations. And we shouldn't be afraid to look at that data and say, I think this is an interesting area of further research. Now I'm going to let the academic researchers and other researchers dive a little bit deeper. We've identified the problem, and we are focused like a laser beam, including now with the Department of Health and Human Services, and we were with intergenerational poverty, of looking at the data all the time and making sure that our outcomes and our strategies are driven by the data. And then trying to figure out whether or not it's evidence-based or evidence-backed, or however you want to frame it, to be able to continue to look in that direction. Our families cannot afford for us to take stabs at what we think is working and go with that. You have to know whether or not it is. And if it isn't, you got to pivot away and you got to reinvest that money somewhere else. They don't have time. I think every day we have a child in our care, that's lost time if you keep holding on to things that are not working. So you've got to be bold and courageous, and the only way to do that is with evidence.
There's a concept I sometimes talk about, which is best information at time of decision, which is not to say that you don't constantly strive for better insight and better learning and continuous feedback loops from the learning, but you also need to be able to sit at the side of decision makers and give them insight that they can use at that moment. And it's a tricky balance for researchers to get that right, but we want our work to have impact, and that's why. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about how we are in a moment where not only state budgets or federal budgets are constrained, but that's going to have a cascading effect on state budgets, is my suspicion. We've certainly seen that we're at a beginning of a discussion, at the end of the discussion, about federal fiscal policy. We already saw some cuts in particularly healthcare budgets and food stamps that you're now having to manage through. How are you thinking about the fiscal challenges that you're facing in Utah? And are there ways, strategies you're thinking about to handle those?
Yeah, I mean, it's an opportunity. We've got a whole department full of people who are really panicked, I would say, and giving them the vision that this is an opportunity. It's forcing us to think about what we're investing in and figuring out whether or not those are the right investments. So I think it's actually a very exciting, it's an exhausting time, I'll be honest, but it's a very exciting time because we don't have a choice, because budgets are starting to contract. And I think it's great that we're being asked to stand up to defend some of the programs that we've had for a really long time. I think that it's the right time to question whether or not some of these programs are working. My theory is that there's enough money in the system, and there are enough programs in the system, and enough strategies in the system. We just have to make sure that those are the ones that are going to move the needle.
Do you worry a little bit about the transition moments here, though, that we're not crystal clear about what some of those paths are, and you're going to have fewer dollars to serve in the short term?
For sure. On the cash assistance side, for sure, there's going to be fewer dollars. I think that it forces a conversation about some of the areas of prevention that we can invest in, and it's always we all feel a little bit unmoored by the uncertainty that we're experiencing, and I think at the end of the day, we're going to come out better for it. And I know that that's terrifying on the cash, certainly on the cash assistance side. And if we're going to face an economic downturn, there's going to be more people coming to our doors for help, and we're going to be continuing to work to make sure that we're making those smart investments.
So you talked a little bit about some of the things that you thought were promising and states could learn from Utah. What are you interested in learning from other states about? What are the questions, what are the models that you're following along around the rest of the country?
Well, this is not as much about the outcomes for the individuals we serve, but we have a very administratively complex organization on the human services side. And I need to free up capacity for our staff to actually do the work that brought them to state government, which is to serve people. And so I personally, and what we're looking on in our department, is exploring more AI. I'm a person of a certain generation. I'm starting to get a little bit more worried about technology and AI in particular. But our staff is completely overwhelmed with all the administrative requirements particularly on the child welfare side. I mean, I don't even know what percentage of their time they have available to actually support families, because there is so much reporting that's required, and I'm really looking forward to having a conversation. We've had it already, continuing to have it with the federal government, but we need tools. And we have a lot of tech companies telling us that they have the solution and the answer, and we have to be very maybe skeptical, cautiously optimistic that the tool that they have will actually help us. But that's an area that I'm really focused on. And I think when you are working on the human services side and the health side, it's imperative that you're willing to talk to other states and find out from them what's working. But as I mentioned, like, all of our states and every single community within our state is so different that you can't always pick up this evidence-based strategy that worked really well in one place and drop it down in a community and say, why didn't it work here? It just always is not translatable. But I'm not doing my job, and our staff isn't doing their job if they're not talking to their colleagues. So I spend a lot of time talking to colleagues across the country, red states, blue states, and brainstorming, because I feel like I owe it. I have an obligation to the people that we serve to do that.
Yeah, my colleagues were very excited about the potential for AI, particularly around benefit enrollment and a lot of other things to streamline access to supports. People spend so much of their time in compliance and understanding what they need to do. On the other hand, deeply worried about some of the ways in which the models may have been trained, and trying to think a little bit about what are principles that you can use for assessing all the things that are kind of black boxes that you are being sold, I'm sure, by 101 vendors. So
Yes.
I think that's a pretty exciting area of work for the whole sector to work on together. And I like the fact that the learning from one another is a really important part of how I think we can be helpful. So I'm going to just say thank you. I appreciate so much. You packed a lot in a very short period of time, and appreciate your work and appreciate you being willing to join us today. So please join me in thanking Director Gruber.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I am going to introduce our moderator of the next panel, our cooperator and colleague in this whole body of work. Hilary Hoynes is the Chancellor Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and also Faculty Director of the Berkeley OLab. She's also co-director of the Innovations in Caste Assistance for Children's Initiative. And if you will have patience for us for 30 seconds while we reset the stage, she and her panel will be joining us. Thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you very much for being here, everybody. Thank you to Sarah for that kind introduction, and welcome to those of you in the room and those of you online for our panel on what does the evidence tell us about income supports and child well-being. I am Hilary Hoynes. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel alongside three incredible colleagues who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I want to start this panel by just providing a little bit of context. So as Sarah described in her opening remarks, this initiative that we're celebrating in this convening today has been joint effort between the Urban Institute and the Berkeley Opportunity Lab that I direct at UC Berkeley. And the focus of our initiative and our collaboration between Urban and the OLab is really deeply about what we're talking about today, which is engaging with the research on income supports for families with children, or what our team internally calls Cash for Kids. And as was described earlier, the earlier impetus for our initiative was indeed the great expansion in supports during the COVID crisis. Centrally, of course, the expansion of the child tax credit for 2021. Of course, as we know, that expansion did turn out to only last for 1 year, but that was a very important year, both for demonstrating what's possible in the many ways that this panel will be talking about in terms of implementation, in terms of what happened to the poverty rate, which was to lower the child poverty rate to 5.2%, which is the lowest poverty rate for children in recorded history that we've been tracking poverty in the United States. Our interest in this panel is really part of the through line of our initiative, and that is in engaging and building a learning agenda about cash, near cash, and in-kind supports for families with children, and how they affect particularly child outcomes in the medium and the long term. So let's start by just like establishing the basic facts that we have today on child poverty in the US. We measure poverty annually in the US, the Census Department does, and our most recent estimates are for calendar year 2024, where we captured that 13.4% of children in America are poor, and that amounts to about 9.7 million children. If you look at the important elements of the social safety net for families with children, it's the tax credits, the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit, that are doing the most work in reducing child poverty. So the Census Department estimates that 3.7 million children would be poor if not for the child tax credits and child tax credits in 2024. And SNAP, or food stamps, is the second largest anti-poverty program for children in America, lifting an additional 1.4 million children out of poverty, as estimated by the Census Department. So with that basic landscape of poverty in the United States, what we want to have a conversation about, and we welcome your questions as indicated by the opening remarks, we want to talk about what we know, not just about the child tax credit, more broadly about income, cash, near cash, and kind supports for children, what we know, what we don't know, and in particular, maybe we will spend some time talking a little bit looking in the future, given the reconciliation tax bill and the important changes that are going to be coming online for, in particular, Medicaid and SNAP. So with that, I'm just delighted to have three exceptional experts on the social safety net joining me today on the stage. To the left of me, and working our way down the row, I've got Jane Waldfogel, who is the Compton Foundation Centennial Professor for the profession of prevention of children's and youth problems at Columbia University School of Social Work. She also holds a position as a visiting professor at the Center for Analysis of Social Exclusion at the London School of Economics. Pam Hurd is the Carol Cohn Professor of Social Policy at the Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And Jacob Bastian is an assistant professor of economics at Rutgers University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. So, I'd like to get started by asking each of you a question to try to kind of scope out the landscape of what we know in terms of the current research about the effects of the social safety net on children. And I'm going to start with a question for Jane, who has a recent book out called Child Benefits, which I recommend to everybody in the room. So she's a good person to start this conversation with. So, you've spent a lot of time recently really diving into this vast array of research that has come online in the past 20 years or so that's focused on how these in-kind supports and cash supports affect children and family well-being. So I'd like you to start by kind of giving us a little bit of a landscape of how you see that work, and maybe if it makes sense, maybe make some connections to what's happening in other countries.
That's great. Thank you, Hillary, for the question, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here. So as Hillary said, I have a new book out called Child Benefits. So in the book, I focus on child benefits. So these are these universal or near universal cash benefits that go to all families with children, or nearly all families with children, on a regular basis. The closest thing we have to that in the United States is the child tax credit, especially during the 2021 expansion, when for 6 months it looked like a child benefit. It went out monthly. It went to nearly all families with children. And as we saw, it had a really dramatic effect on the child poverty rate and other outcomes. So I really wanted to juxtapose the evidence on the child tax credit and other American programs with what we know from peer countries around the world. Our peer countries around the world have had child benefits for more than 100 years now. So we kind of have a lot of evidence from those countries. So in the book, I focus in particular on our peer countries, so the other wealthy nations that make up the OECD. So we're comparing really like to like. And so I wanted to look at 5 questions that are really important for policymakers. And the first one is, how do families spend the money? If families get these regular cash benefits month in and month out, do they spend it on items for children, or are they using it in ways that we wouldn't, think are necessarily helpful? So fortunately, the evidence there is very clear. We have more than 20 studies from around the world. Families spend the benefits on items for children, books and toys, clothing and footwear, musical instruments, childcare, education expenses. They also spend the money on essentials for families, family necessities like food and housing costs, utility bills, but all things that benefit children and families. They don't spend the money on alcohol and tobacco. So when benefits go up, spending does not go up on alcohol and tobacco. The evidence from the United States, when we look at the expansion during the child tax credit, and here we have dozens of studies, is absolutely consistent. So families spend the money on items for children, food, housing, essentials for families, and they don't spend the money on alcohol and tobacco. So that's good to know. What other questions preoccupy American policymakers? Employment is a big one. So if you give families more cash, are they going to cut back on their employment? It's a really important question, although it's a question that really comes from the literature about welfare reform and welfare programs, and child benefits are not welfare programs. These are universal benefits. They're not contingent on employment or earnings. So it's not clear that there would be such a strong connection. And in fact, the evidence from around the world doesn't find a strong connection between child benefits and employment. More importantly, when we look at the expansion in 2021, the 6 months that the child benefit was expanded, there have been 13 studies of the employment effects. 11 of those studies found little or no effect on parents' employment. 2 of the studies found some evidence of cutbacks in employment, but the evidence was not entirely consistent. And so my reading of the evidence is there's either little or no effect of the expansions on parental employment. Now, I want to be really clear, this was a temporary expansion. It was during COVID. Future reforms could have a different effect, but even if you model what we think are reasonable effects, the effects are not large. And I think it's because, there was a qualitative study by Angela Rashidi at American Enterprise, and she found that most of the parents she talked to didn't change their employment at all. Some parents reduced their employment, especially those with young kids. Some parents increased their employment. If you have cash coming in on a regular basis, you can pay for childcare, you can get the car on the road. So the effects can go in both directions. Okay, another question that comes up is fertility. So you give parents money when they have children, and each child you have, you get a higher benefit. Are parents going to have more children just to get these benefits? Well, we know as academics that there's been a host of research and a host of efforts by governments to affect fertility, and it's really, really hard to do. So a bunch of countries, Singapore, you name it, have tried everything they can to increase fertility. South Korea, it's really hard. Child benefits also don't budge fertility, or not very much. There is one kind of program that actually does have an effect on fertility. These are these lump sum birth grants, where a country will say, if you have a new baby, you're going to get $5,000, 5,000 euros. I mean, these are big, eye-catching numbers. And these programs do have some effect on fertility, but those are not child benefits. Those are very different. Most important probably to us in this room is what about the effects on poverty and child and family well-being? So as Hillary said, during the 2021 expansion, child poverty in the United States fell to its lowest ever level, 5%. That's on a par with Denmark and Finland. We've never had a child poverty rate that low. It was almost a 50% reduction. And really sadly, when the extension ended, the child poverty rate more than doubled. Right. So it's really sad, but we do have evidence on both sides. You expand the benefits, poverty plummets. You take away the benefits, poverty goes back up again. And we also have evidence on material hardship. Those effects are very dramatic. So what about child and family well-being? And by that I mean children's health, their mental health, their cognitive development, their school performance, parents' health and well-being. Obviously, it's kind of recent since 2021. We haven't had too long a time to follow the children in terms of long-term effects. We do know that parents who got the benefits were less stressed and experienced less strain. And we have several studies that point to reductions in child abuse and neglect, which as a former child welfare worker, I find amazing because that is very tough to address. And so that's really promising evidence. From the studies around the world where they've been able to follow children for longer, we know that families who receive these benefits, those children go on to have better educational performance, better health, better mental health. Their parents have better mental health. And we're fortunate that we have a handful, not even a handful, probably 4 studies in the United States, most of them done by Hillary and her co-authors or by Diane Schanzenbach, who's here in the audience. Looking historically at families who benefited from the expansion of cash or near cash programs, how did those children do when they became young adults? So programs like food stamps or the Mother's Pension Program. And we know from those studies that children who grew up in a family that got those benefits when the child was young, those children, when they're young adults, they're healthier, they're more educated, they're more likely to be working, they're less likely to be involved in crime, they're less likely to be in benefits, they have lower mortality. So these are the long-run benefits. And when you do benefit cost analyses of these, you find that for every dollar that we invest in these programs, we get back more than $10 in return. So that's, a remarkable return on investment. So I think the subtitle of my book is A Smart Investment for America's Future. I wasn't bold enough to say the smart investment or the smartest. I mean, I didn't examine all programs, but I can tell you for sure it is a smart investment.
Well, that's really a great start to this conversation. I really appreciate you giving us that broad view about the U.S. versus other countries and so on. So I want to move to Jacob now to sort of continue this conversation about what we know before we get to the what we don't know. And in particular, Jane talked a lot about these kind of child benefits, also about, mention of food stamps. You've done a lot of work, some of the most important work on the long-term effects of the tax credits. And as I said earlier, the current landscape of American social policy, the tax credits are doing the most work in lowering child poverty. So I'd love to hear you talk about what we know about the long-term effects or medium and long-term effects of these tax credits and how that helps to kind of build the evidence base about what these programs do in a kind of intergenerational way.
Thank you, Hillary. So thank you, Jane. That was such a great start to this panel. So for those I do not know and do not know me, my name is Jacob Bastian, and I am fortunate to be on this panel with amazing panelists and to talk about a topic that I'm very lucky that I get to study for my job and my career. So Jane already laid out so many important details, and I'm going to try to weave in some more here and there. So we know that the U.S. Does not have a child benefit program except for 6 months in 2021. And what we have is some benefits that reach a lot of families, but they're primarily for working families. Tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. So even though there's a lot of evidence from around the world that child benefits do a lot of good, we have some evidence from the temporary credit, but what we have in 2025 are these 2 tax credits that reach working families. And so, what we know from that is that the families that do get these credits, the credits do a lot of good. So even though, several million families and children have income too low or the parents do not work, they don't benefit from these. But the families that do get these tax credits, the benefits are incredible. So Jane already laid out some, I'm going to lay out a little bit more. So for the parents, you get more money. That's great. That's going to increase household resources. That's going to decrease stress. That's going to help families pay the bill. That's going to reduce evictions. That's going to just help with a number of things. It's going to lower poverty. And it's even going to help families move to better locations. It's going to help families move to areas with more opportunity. They can move out of distressed places to places with better schools, better resources. And that's really important. For the kids, I think I'm just going to lay it out kind of from birth to what we know long run. And so we know from work by Hillary and others that when families get these tax credits, the kids are healthier right off the bat. They're born healthier. They're less likely to be low birth weight, and so they're getting a better start in life. We know from a number of researchers, Janet Curry and others, that birth weight, health at very young ages has a strong predictor for how people do 20, 30, 40, 50 years later. So this is really important. And so these kids, they grow up, they're healthier when they're young, they're doing better in school, their test scores are higher, their behavior is better, the home environment is better, and so they're in a stronger position. Some of my research with others shows that these kids, even when they grow up, they're more likely to finish high school. They're more likely to go to college. They're more likely to finish college. You follow these kids to their 20s, through their 30s, they're more likely to work in their 20s and 30s. They're more likely to earn more money. They're less likely to be on other forms of public assistance. They're more likely to be paying taxes. These are incredible long-run benefits. And so not only do these tax credits help these families, but as a society, this is a good investment. This isn't just giving money and helping somebody not be hungry. This is helping families and investing in their human capital and in their futures, and that has benefits for all of us. And so, as an economist, I often, the way I teach this subject is to say, even if you don't care about poor families,
Right.
it's still a good use of money because these kids are less likely to be committing crimes. They're more likely to grow up and pay taxes and use other forms of welfare. And so, this is actually fantastic from just an investment human capital point of view. They're incredibly cost effective. So, perhaps these tax credits could be even better if they reached even more families. But what we do have is a very cost effective program. Again, I mentioned these kids, they grow up, they're working more, they're using less public assistance. Every dollar that the government is spending on these tax credits, they're basically getting at least another dollar back in the form of less spending on incarceration, less spending on adverse health outcomes. These people are paying more taxes because they're more likely to work. So this is really a smart investment. And another thing I wanted to bring up was why. We'll talk more about this as the panel goes on, but why do these tax credits help people? Is it just the money? Is it because, especially for single parent households, these parents are more likely to work? Maybe it's having the role model effect. Maybe it's actually the earned income that's having a bigger impact than the unearned income. We have a lot of evidence. Alaska has a program. Canada has a program. There's a lot of cash transfer programs, and there is an ongoing debate about, and this is relevant for states and localities that are trying to expand their own EITC or CTC. And I have research showing that, yes, having a working mother could provide a role model effect, but really it's the money. A dollar is a dollar, and if you give families money, they do better. The reason we know that, we can prove this. The reason we know this is because among the EITC, something that I study, we know that single parents work more in response to the EITC because of the way it's structured. But these long-run benefits are not just among these kids. These long-run benefits are also seen among low-income kids who grow up with two-parent households. A population we know, they don't change their labor supply in response to these tax credits. And so just giving money to these families, the fact that these kids are doing better 20 years later shows that actually just giving people $1,000 or $2,000 or $5,000 a year is going to have positive long-run effects. And so obviously the effects are bigger among single-parent families because the incomes are lower on average, and so another $1,000 is going to go further. But basically we know, and I have ongoing research showing this, that the benefits extend to everybody. The earned income, that's going to do good for families, but the unearned income or the transfer income is also going to do a lot of good things. And there's a number of other income pilots when we'll talk about a lot of those evidence. But I think I'll stop there. But yeah, thanks again, and it's great to be here.
All right, thank you so much for that. So Pam, I'd like to finish this first round with you. And I'd like to talk a little bit with you about what you've learned around the importance of not what we're doing, but how we do it. So you've written an incredibly influential book, really putting a spotlight on the implementation of programs, something that used to be like you talk about like in the corner of public policy schools, but now it's like in the front row. So administrative burdens, implementation. You know, take a bite at that. Tell us about what you think you've learned and what's important in the context of delivering these kinds of programs that we're talking about, the tax credits, the child benefits, Medicaid, food stamps, you know, whatever feels like the most kind of important to highlight in this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I think we've learned two big lessons. The first lesson is that basically the number of hurdles you put in front of people, the number of steps you require them to go through to access a benefit or service, on average, the less likely they're going to access it. And I think we used to kind of think, well, people who really need these supports, they're going to jump through those hoops because they really need them. And I think our evidence base at this point contradicts that, basically. I think we just see a lot of evidence now that in many cases, the people who need these benefits the most are just not able to get through those hurdles. So what do I mean by the hurdles, right? Like complicated and confusing paperwork, tons of documentation requirements, interviews, which I'll mention again in a minute. These sort of procedural steps that people have to get through, they struggle to get through them. And it's not just that they struggle to get through them, even the people who get onto these programs end up feeling sometimes disempowered, frustrated, and overall like pretty stressed by these processes in ways I don't think we want to happen, right? Like that's clearly not a goal of these processes. So just like one example or a couple of examples here, the SNAP program, the food stamp program. In California, about 3 in 10 of every person eligible for SNAP doesn't receive those benefits. Good chunk, large chunk of those folks, they need the benefits. They just can't quite get through the process. Or even the folks who get on the process, and we see this across programs, struggle to stay on the program. So for example, roughly 20 to 25% of SNAP beneficiaries who lose their benefits when they're annually kind of or trying to show they're still eligible, roll back on the program within 4 months, and most of them within just 1 to 2 months. That's not good for those families. There's a really nice report that Urban Institute actually did with the FNS where families really did talk about this. They were like, it's terrible. You show up at the grocery store, you go to use your SNAP card, and it's mortifying. Like you can't use this.
Right.
And then on top of it, people are struggling to feed their family, right? These are not the outcomes we want. Another example would be at the end of the pandemic, another big thing we did was we just kept people on the Medicaid program, but in 2023, we had to renew everyone on the Medicaid program. And what we saw was that process, about 70% of people who lost their Medicaid coverage lost it for procedural reasons, missing paperwork, basically. They didn't get it in the mail. The state couldn't find them. And again, it's pretty awful to show up at a physician's office really needing access to health care. And this happened to a lot of disabled kids too, and realize you don't have Medicaid anymore, right? Like these are not the experiences we want people to have when they're interacting with these programs. The second lesson we've learned, though, and this is my optimistic.
Yes, please.
I don't mean to be all negative. The second lesson we've learned is we have learned a lot of different lessons about how to improve service delivery. So writ large, reduce the number of steps. If you can't reduce the number of steps, make it easier. So what do I mean by this? Going back to Medicaid, a lot of states ended up, and this was in part a function of what the Biden administration pushed, was you can do automated renewals for Medicaid, okay? So basically, state gathers all kinds of information, looks at a person who's like, we know they're still eligible. We don't need them to go through any steps. That led, we have some research showing, to pretty substantial reductions, not just in the amount of time that people didn't have to waste anymore, but they were less likely to be procedurally denied, and they were more likely to be retained in the program. So that's like one example. If you can't do that, that kind of automation, you can do things to make steps easier. So there's actually a lot of good evidence around SNAP, for example, that with the interviews, we have to keep the interviews, but instead of saying to a mom with 2 kids struggling in a low-income job, you have to do an interview on X date at X time, you say to them, you know what, call this number up. Do it when you can get to it. Because the reality is for a lot of those families, if you're working in a low-wage job, you can't just say to your manager at Starbucks, no, I'm sorry, I have to step out for an hour.
Right.
That's not realistic. And we have really good evidence that that really substantially, and both in California and Colorado, substantially increased the number of people completing those processes and staying on the programs.
Wow, thank you so much. That's just a terrific start to this conversation. So I know many people in this room and online are thinking to themselves, what are these people talking about? Haven't I heard that cash doesn't matter? Sarah has already mentioned that in her introductory comments. I know it's already come up, and we have some great questions here. So I want to talk a little bit about the current findings on cash before I shift to, I want to end with kind of like a lightning round where we go over a lot of these questions, because there's terrific questions coming in. So, you know, there's been a lot of attention lately to the evidence that's come out on babies' first years, which has been, you know, a couple of years worth of studies, with the very prominent piece in the Times by Jason DeParle, talking with one of the authors of that study. And then more recently than that was this basic income experiment, open research experiment with some PIs at the University of Michigan that also had work focused on children. And, you know, essentially a lot of the findings from that work were, you know, that these cash assistance programs, which were limited term, didn't seem to move the needle on the child development, parental engagement, the kinds of investments that I think our hypotheses have been, you know, swirling around as part of the mechanisms that might explain some of the findings that we've been talking about. So I'd really love to have each of you contribute whatever wisdom you might have in thinking and helping everybody think about how to make sense of us telling you that there's robust evidence that providing cash, near cash, tax credits, and in-kind assistance leads to dramatic intergenerational improvements, but yet we're not finding evidence from these recent cash pilots. So maybe, why don't I start with you, Jacob, on the other end here.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm sure everybody has a lot to say on this topic, so I'll try to keep my remarks kind of short so we don't just stay here for the next half an hour. So I know a lot of the researchers engaged in these topics. They do very good work. They do very careful work. Yep. And so I think it's important to study this topic. I would say big picture, we know from lots of countries around the world, big sample sizes, that these policies do a lot of good things. Now, in my worldview, I'm an economist. I believe there's standard errors on everything. And so, you know, when we do a pilot, let's say there's 500 women or 1,000 mothers or something, and you give them $300 a month or $500 a month, you might find an effect, but there's going to be a standard error there, and that's going to, you know, sometimes be significant, sometimes not be significant, and that's the way the world is. It's kind of unsatisfying. And so a lot of these studies are on like very, very low income populations. I think we also have to think about short run analysis versus long run analysis. A lot of these studies were done during 2021. I think there was something else major happening in the world in 2021. And so, you know, you have to take these things with grains of salt. Think about the context. You know, there was a lot of other income support programs helping the treatment and control group during those times. And so that's something to think about. So I think I'll stop there.
Excellent, thank you. Pam?
I would just sort of say briefly, I feel like these guys have more thoughtful things to say than I do, but I would just sort of say briefly, you know, the experiments are amazing, RCTs like this are amazing, but I think what we also know is it is a we know that this was an outcome in a particular place and a particular time with a very particular population. And so how we think about generalizing that up when we have a wealth of additional evidence and data, I just think we just need to be really carefully when we think about those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys have made a lot of good points, so I'll try to say what I can say that would be adding something different. So what can I say that would add something different? Yeah, so the amount of, one issue with babies' first years is the amount of the benefit. I think most people don't realize that the benefit was per family rather than per child.
$300 was
So it's
the treatment,
$300
right.
per, roughly
Right.
$300 per month was the treatment. But the average family in baby's first years had between 2 and 3 children. So when we're thinking about the child tax credit, if you'd had 2 or 3 children, you would have been receiving, say, $600 or $900 per month, not $300 per month. So that benefit was being stretched over a lot of people in the family. When people talk to the moms in baby's first years, they say, well, you know, it allowed me to go to the dollar store and buy a toy for my child at the dollar store, to get a popsicle for my child. It was really very little money. And as Jacob was saying, during the period that this was happening, especially in for the early period of baby's first years, it's COVID. So everyone in the treatment and control group is hunkered down with COVID. In the latter period, this is the period of the CTC expansion and the huge increase in benefits, as well as the expanded unemployment insurance, the stimulus checks. So I think families in those years were receiving something like $12,000 per year, which really swamps the effect of the program, both for the treatment and the controls. What I find kind of really curious about baby's first years is that, you know, we were talking earlier about the effect of these programs on poverty and hardship. That's kind of the first order effect.
Food insecurity maybe being another one of these hardship measures, right?
The most important form of hardship that we
Yep.
usually measure.
Yep.
So baby's first years doesn't actually find any significant effects of the
Right.
treatment on hardship, on food insecurity or other forms of hardship.
Quite puzzling, really.
So that's really puzzling, unless you think that the benefit was very low and that the benefit is being swamped by the benefits that both the treatment and the control are receiving.
Right.
The moms were not less stressed. The moms actually in the treatment group were, if anything, slightly more stressed. So when you think about the theory of change, this is a program that's supposed to reduce poverty and hardship, financial strain and stress, and then improve child well-being. Well, if it doesn't reduce hardship and food insecurity and other forms of hardship, it doesn't reduce maternal stress, then how would it improve child well-being? Do you see what I mean?
Right.
So, yeah, and there is always something different about a sort of targeted model program where you get screened into the program. You answer a lot of questions about how poor you are and how really poor you are, and then you get invited to join the program. Is very different from a government program that says all families with children deserve support, and you know, you have a child, we're going to send you a check. So the families, you know, they had a lot of worries about, is this money going to go away? By the end of the program, by the end of the first 3 or 4 years or 5 years, the families in baby's first years were actually less likely to get other public benefits. So they'd kind of withdrawn from other public benefits, maybe because they were thinking like, I don't feel comfortable going in and claiming fuel assistance or other things because I'm getting this private program. So yeah, and I guess the last thing I would say is, I think at last count, there's more than 100 such experiments running in the United States.
Right.
There is
So
an
many.
explosion of interest in basic income, programs for children. So I really think somebody should round up the evidence on all 100 of those programs,
Right.
and not just on 1 or 2. And I'm sort of resisting the temptation to do it myself, but I really think somebody should do this.
Somebody listening right now.
Somebody listening right now should
Right.
do this, because you know, it's just one program. It's, you know, it's an all-star team, but it is just one study.
You know, I was thinking when Sam was giving his remarks in the beginning about this question and whether, you know, we've learned something here, and we need to keep learning. I don't think it shuts things down. I don't think it negates the evidence we have that there are documented long-term findings. maybe it's what happened and the context around it. Possibly we've also learned that maybe the mechanisms that we thought were at play might not be those mechanisms. Like at this point, it really is a little bit, maybe too much of a black box than ideally we'd like, but that's where the additional work needs to go to try to unpack it. So thank you so much. Okay, so we've got a little less than 10 minutes left, and we've got some terrific questions here, so I'd like to go to some of those. I want to follow up with Pam on one thing in particular, and that is in thinking about how much the United States has leaned into the tax credits for the purposes of reducing child poverty. It seems quite important to recognize that filling out taxes is not a small thing. And indeed, you know, huge parts of the population who have, you know, unstable work and are not working regular full-time employment aren't even obliged to file taxes because they're not earning enough. Yet if they don't, they're leaving a lot on the table. So what have we learned in that space in particular? And you know, how big a nut is that to crack in terms of trying to be effective users of the policies that we have in place now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do know, for example, that there are a good chunk of families, the estimates vary, but say around 20% of people eligible for the earned income tax credit who don't receive it. And a good chunk of them don't receive it because they're not connected to the tax system for all of the reasons you described. There's a really nice paper that California Policy Lab did actually looking at the California tax credit, so their supplement. And they found when they looked at a sample of SNAP beneficiaries who were eligible for the California version of it, only half of them were receiving it. So that's not ideal. And I do think the key issue here is, like, on the one hand, there are really nice characteristics to delivering benefits through the tax system, and we saw this actually with the temporary child tax credit, which it can be easier to automate, so it can be easier to just like deliver benefits to people. The problem is that chunk of folks not connected to the tax system.
Exactly.
Right? And I do think it's really important that while we keep pushing on, if we want to, get a permanent extension, for example, of the child tax credit, we have to deal with that, I guess is what I'd say. And what we have found that doesn't work is, for example, nudges, sending people like a thing, oh, you might be eligible for this, doesn't work. It looks like two versions, you either give people a lot of hands-on assistance to get them through the process, or we better leverage administrative data within the federal government and within state governments to really find people. But I think there is something sort of inherently unfair, if I'll go as far as to say this, that we, when we deliver benefits through something like the tax system, that people end up getting treated really differently, right? Like some people get the fast lane, the super easy lane, and then another bunch of folks, arguably the folks who need these benefits the most, end up with like much more complicated, difficult processes.
Yeah, well, that there's a connection between that, I was just thinking, and a question for you, Jane, that I want to try to pull together, and that is, in many countries in delivering child benefits, it actually doesn't operate through tax credits, right? So tell us, enlighten us about how other countries do this. Now, I realize that in most of these countries, they're doing something different than what we're doing. It's more unconditional, but still, if we were to add an unconditional child tax credit to our base set of supports, what could we learn from the way other countries do this that doesn't fall us into this trap of having to bear the costs, or not trap, but additional burden of having to have people to face the tax system?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So all of our peer countries either provide these benefits universally to all families with children, that's the majority, or maybe a third of them don't do it universally, but for sure cover all low and middle income families. And of course we do just the opposite, so we cover middle and high income families, and the families we leave out, it's like 25%, 30% of American kids are in families that don't get the full child tax credit. They get no credit at all, they get only a partial credit. because their earnings are too low. So if you make it unconditional, it's so straightforward. The minute the child is born, you get a birth certificate, the check goes out. So there's no application, there's no eligibility, there's no screening. The check goes out. And the check goes out month in, month out. And when the next child is born, the check keeps going out, but with a different value, because now you have twice the benefit. And when your third child is born, you get 3 times the benefit. It's like pretty easy to do. Do you have to worry about when the child moves to a different household, moves in with the grandparents or the father? Yes, but the initial benefit and the ongoing benefit is absolutely easy and straightforward. So yeah, it is a lot administratively more simple if it's universal.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. As well as more
Without a doubt.
equitable and fair.
Yeah.
But the idea that we would leave out the lowest income families is just crazy.
Right. I want to combine a couple of questions. I'm going to put this one to Jacob. There was one question that was kind of along the lines of, okay, I understand this evidence about these long-term impacts. What do we know about the, I guess, intensive margin of benefits? So, for example, is it providing a basic element, or what happens when it's larger? So kind of like that question about the amount and what do we know about that. And I want to package that with another question I think came from my co-author Diane Schanzenbach, which was sort of along the lines of, okay, we have these long-term impacts, but they're not a miracle cure. They're not getting rid of these disadvantages and differences across generations. They're moving the needle in a statistically significant sense, but they're not transformational. So they're small. I like to say they're small, but they add up. They're sound investments. So putting those two things together, what are your thoughts on the state of knowledge, or maybe what we need to know about scale and scope and magnitude of these impacts?
Yeah, great. All right. I have so many things I want to say.
Awesome.
And I'm not going to.
You have 4 minutes.
I'm not. I'm not.
Or maybe
gonna,
less.
I'm not going to forget any of them as I go. So, in economist language, one way to frame both of these things is like, what's the marginal treatment effect?
There we go.
So people get benefits, that's great, but would even more benefits be even better, or do the effects kind of flatten out? So you give a family another, $5,000 a year. What if we gave them $8,000 a year? What if we gave them $10,000 a year? And we do know that as the EATC has gotten larger, as states have piggybacked on, we know that the long-run effects continue to grow. So we have not yet reached the plateau point. So if you're a major city or a state or in the federal government, increasing these programs is still a good way to continue to improve the lives of these kids. And so that's kind of like a way of addressing both of these points, is that it's not a cure-all. You give a low-income family more money, and on average, the kid's going to grow up, and when they're 25, they're going to earn another $1,000 a year. They're going to be like 1 or 2% more likely to work. That's something, but clearly there's still poor people, and there's still low-income workers, and so what do? Well, one answer is to give the family even more benefits. That will continue to bump up the effect. It's not going to do everything. The last thing I want to say is I wanted to answer their question too, so I'm going to.
Go for it.
So my brother is training for a marathon, and he told me that he has an A goal and a B goal. And so I have an A goal and a B goal when it comes to changing public policy. So my A goal would be something like a universal benefit for everybody. My B goal is, given our current policy, if you're a city, a state out there, we can increase take-up. Even among families that get the CTC and the EITC, a lot of them use tax preparers. They're not free. So if you're getting, a large refund check, but you have to go pay $500 at H&R Block to do this, this isn't a knock against H&R Block, but if cities or local communities organize, there are these programs where they help people file taxes. That would be a way of helping more of the money go to the families that it's actually intended to go to. And that doesn't have to be a federal policy change. That could be me and my church, me and my neighbors get together and we do this. And so that's something that kind of like on a micro level could help more benefits go to more families. So that's my beagle.
I love your beagle.
That's great.
I mean, just to piggyback on that, I think the other thing that cities and states can do, and they have done already, of course, is pass their own tax credits. So for years, states have had tax credits that augment the value of the federal EITC, and now 16 states have state child tax credits that augment the value of the federal one. And this is, it also, you know, this point about different benefit levels and incremental benefits, we can learn from the states about that because they're topping up the values. So there's a lot for us to learn in the next few years.
There is a lot for us to learn in the next few years, which I think is a terrific place to land this conversation. I want to thank Jane and Pam and Jacob for being with us today. I thank you all for your questions. And we now have a 10-minute break for coffee for those of you who are in the room. And do not delay, because our next session will be none other than Governor Wes Moore in conversation with Catherine Rampell. So please, we welcome you back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hello again. Whoops. There be light. There we go. Hi again, everybody, and welcome again to all of you online. I am so excited to introduce our next speaker, my governor, I like saying that, and also a source of real passion and commitment on today's topic, Governor Wes Moore of Maryland. In his first term as governor, Governor Moore has focused on improving the well-being of children and families in Maryland by reducing child poverty and expanding social programs for all of his constituents. While the federal government has not focused on cash assistance for low-income families in this current period, Maryland has gone in a different direction. His first bill signing as governor, the Family Prosperity Act of 2023, was focused on reducing child poverty in Maryland by permanently extending one of the most generous state EITCs in the nation and enacting a state child tax credit to cover children under 6 in the lowest income families. But as we know, and I gather Pam heard discussed earlier today, a well-designed policy is only half the equation. How a program is administered is crucial to ensuring that families actually receive the benefits that they have earned. So the governor has gone beyond expanding valuable tax credits and also focused on making it easier for families to access them. The administration has been working with Maryland's comptroller, Brooke Learman, my old friend and colleague, who has also partnered with the Urban Institute to understand how we can best improve the take-up of the tax credits that have already been passed by law. This focus on making it easier to access benefits is not limited to tax credits. Governor Moore's administration has created a unified benefits screener to help Marylanders check their eligibility and easily apply for benefits like Medicaid, food assistance, and home energy assistance using a mobile app. Maryland hasn't only increased cash assistance through tax benefits and improved access to these benefits, Governor Moore's administration has taken a whole of government, whole community approach to improving the well-being of families and children in the state by recognizing that no single policy or agency can improve the lives of children on its own. And I love hearing the echoes between these two very different governors who talk of themselves as brothers in so many ways. This bursting down of silos we heard about from Director Gruber as well. The governor created the first governor's office for children, which is tasked with the well-being, improving the well-being of all the kids in Maryland and ending poverty in the state. And that office is led by another of my dear friends, Cabinet Secretary for Children, Carmel Martin. The Governor's Office for Children administers the Enough Initiative, known as Engaging Neighborhoods, Organizations, Unions, Governments, and Households. Hard to remember, but it spells enough, which focuses on addressing concentrated poverty in Maryland with targeted community-led solutions, and it recently issued their first grants. And I'm so pleased to note that we have been privileged at Urban as researchers to be partners in the Enough Project, helping them to target the goals and outcomes that they'll be aiming for and measuring. I'm excited for all of us to learn from the governor more about what Maryland is doing to invest in children, what drives the current approach, and what other states and federal governments can learn from Maryland, as we learned earlier from Utah. We're also super excited to have moderating the conversation with the governor, Catherine Rampell, anchor at MSNBC and soon to be economics editor at The Bulwark. I'm also an addict to Marketplace, where I get to hear her many Fridays telling us what the new economic news of the week meant. She's my regular source. Previously, Catherine was a longtime opinion columnist at the Washington Post. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Rampell and Governor Wes Moore.
Thanks so much for joining us, and thank you especially to Governor Moore for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
I was wondering if we could just start out by talking about why this issue is important to you. I know that you are very into the child tax credit and eradicating child poverty in general. What's your connection? What's Maryland's connection to the issue?
Yeah, it's first, thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Urban Institute just for all the leadership, all the partnership, all the work. It really is an honor to be in this work with you. So bless you, Susanna. Thank you. You know, I don't know how a society can call itself humane when it allows child poverty. I just don't. I mean, I don't think how when you have a society that is helping to determine children's future before the children even have a say, I don't know how you can call yourself humane. And you know, I'm new to office. This is the first office I ever ran for was governor. And when people say, you know, what made you want to become a politician? I was like, I didn't. I wanted to be the governor because there's a unique role that governor plays. And I learned that firsthand, frankly, where before I ran for governor, I was running one of the country's largest poverty fighting organizations. And I remember working with a former governor, and I was trying to get him to talk about and institute a child tax credit. And I was explaining to him all the data behind the importance of the child tax credit. You could literally help to cut the child poverty rate in half, what it would mean for families. And I told him you should talk about it in your State of the State address. And I even gave him the line that he should use on it. And I got an advance copy of the State of the State. And there was nothing in there about child poverty, nothing in there about the child tax credit. And I was pissed off. And so I called up the head of public policy of the organization I ran, and I just was like fuming. And he said to me, finally, after I breathed, this guy, Jason Cohen, the guy who ran the policy wing, he said to me, he said, listen, you know, we've worked for 6 months to try to get him to include a line in the speech. But what if you could write the whole speech? And that was kind of the point. Right? It's like, you know, when people say, well, why do you think that, you know, that the work that we're doing in policy can have a bigger impact on, you know, poverty than anything else? My answer is, why do you think poverty exists? Poverty exists because we have bad policies that continue to put and leave people in poverty and make it impossible for them to escape out of. And so the reason that this is a very important issue for me is, honestly, this is my why I decided to do this in the first place. It was not to, you know, running for office was not something that you're excited to do. Addressing this issue was something I was. And I knew that if you did not have a state government and a governor's office that didn't just have the intention, but had the absolute, like, maniacal obsession to deal with this, then we were just going to continue cleaning up the debris that comes from broken policies.
So you've described your own maniacal obsession with this issue. I suspect there's some other maniacs in this room. My question to you is, how do you get voters to care about this? And the reason why
Such a good question.
The reason I ask this is that, as has been brought up at this event or this initiative was partly linked to the American Rescue Plan, increased child tax credit, which was there for only 1 year. And at the time, my understanding was everybody assumed there would be such a groundswell of support for this policy that it would not be allowed to lapse.
Yeah.
Instead, it lapsed. If you look at polling, people are generally positive on it, but it's not a salient issue, and you can see that in like the 2022 midterm advertising, for example. Only 1% of ads even mention the child tax credit, so it just doesn't seem like it motivates people.
Yeah.
My first question about all of this is, why do you think that is, that this policy in particular was allowed to lapse, and that this hasn't been an animating issue, again, outside of this room, for voters?
It's such a good question, because like I was part of that group that felt that when people were like, well, they'll just put a lapse on the CTC. I was honestly part of that group who was so naive, who thought there's no way they're going to kick that many children back into poverty. And they did. Like, I was naive on it. And I remember having conversations with some of the people who, you know, when people talk about our campaign, it wasn't like all like neophytes. We had a couple like, you know, experts who I kind of knew what they were doing about running campaigns. But one of the things they said to me consistently was, you should stop talking about poverty. Like the word. You can talk about the issues. Don't say the word. The word doesn't poll well. And if people think that you're going to run for governor because you want to end poverty, because you want to end child poverty, they're like, you're going to lose. And my response consistently was, then let me lose. Because I don't know how to talk about things that I don't have passion for. It's why I'm running. And so I think that the thing that we really had to do, and I think that the part of the thing you have to do when it comes to getting public opinion on board, is first of all, you have to get very granular and very local. That you cannot talk about this from a 30,000-foot view, because then people won't really understand what it is you're talking about. That you've got to actually go in and work with communities to make sure that when you are talking about the importance of whether it is child tax credit, whether it's importance of raising minimum wages, whether it's important of job training programs, whether it's important of the earned income tax credit, the things that you're talking about, you've got to get really granular, really local, and make sure that people actually see what it is you're talking about, or else it just sounds like it's a research paper.
So what's an example of that in this context?
People laughed at that. I mean, so perfect example. Like, so when we started laying out what was our platform going in, we were very specific, and we worked specifically with communities on it. And so, for example, you know, one of the things that we did when we came on board, first thing, when we gave our first State of the State, when I talked about the State of the State address, probably spent about 15 minutes in my first State of the State just talking all about child poverty, and talked about how this was going to be a time when Maryland was going to do the most aggressive bipartisan assault on child poverty that this state has ever seen. And we then started giving specific examples and talking about things like raising a minimum wage, you know, making the child tax credit permanent, enhancing earned income tax credit, all the things. But then specifically on the ENOUGH Act. And it is right, it is an acronym, and it is a long acronym, but you know, engaging neighborhoods, organizations, unions, governments, and households. And it's basically like la-di-da-di everybody. But the beautiful thing about ENOUGH and the crafting of it is it's really the ideas are driven from the community, where this is not us telling the community what you need to do. Because honestly, that's the fastest way to get organ rejection for a lot of the initiatives and the things that we care about, because then you don't, if that's the way it's coming off, you don't look like you're actually trying to solve the problem.
So is there an example of something
Yep.
that came, yes, please.
Yeah, sorry. So for example, if you look at the work that we're doing so there's 27 ENOUGH communities all across the state of Maryland, and it's urban, rural, and suburban. And really, and it's all about which communities fall into communities that were deemed as dealing with not just concentrated, but oftentimes generational child poverty. And the issues are going to be different for the individual communities. So for example, Hagerstown happens to be a rural community out in Western Maryland. So we were actually working with Hagerstown, and they were identifying some of the big issues that they were working on, some of the big things that they needed. Hagerstown was a place where we knew that the opioid issue was a distinct issue inside of that community, so we said we've got to put a real focus on dealing with that. It's also a place where we started doing some, some of our initial test work on things like cash payments and cash assistance for families. And so, but that again, that wasn't something that came from us. That came from them, where they were the ones to identify, and the solutions that they had were different than what we're getting from Park Heights in Baltimore.
So what metrics do you use then to determine whether these experiments are working, particularly if there's a lot of heterogeneity across communities, they're all doing different things?
Yep.
How do you assess whether anything is working? What are you measuring?
So I think a lot of what we're doing for the individual communities and kind of like, the RCT and testing that you have on board is all going to be individual and specific based on the community, because we're using different platforms, right? Where whether you're focusing on gun violence prevention in one neighborhood or whether you're focusing on job training in another one, you're going to have different metrics. And so that's actually where the partnership really comes on board. The thing that we knew as state government is the enough platform, and again, it's not just an initiative, it's literally, it's a change in a governance philosophy. It's how we actually view our work and how we view our partnerships. So we're actually working closely with whether it's the Urban Institute, whether it's the foundation world, and really being to be able to identify not just how we're providing additional financial supports, but also how are we doing evaluations to determine what's working, what's scalable, how do we take the lessons learned from our tier 1 communities and as our tier 2, tier 3 communities, as they start moving up the ladder, that we know that this is a best practice that actually works versus this is something that we think there's some things we could actually fix and adjust on it.
And is one of the objectives specifically what's the child poverty rate in this in this community before and after? I mean, that's what I'm trying to get a sense of. Like, how are you?
What's the child poverty rate? What's the measure of not just economic mobility, but sustainable economic mobility? Because something that we know with a lot of initiatives is you can have people who can move up, but then move back down very quickly. And so we're really focusing on sustainable economic mobility and actually driving down a long-term rate when it comes to child poverty. What becomes the things that we know are scalable, are leverageable on federal and state influences versus what are the things that are standalone, because that actually matters when it comes to the scale conversation as well. And listen, there's no doubt that the cruelty of this federal administration has its impacts. And I think every governor in every state is trying to navigate what it's like when you've essentially lost the federal government as a partner inside this work. However, at the same time, the metrics on what we're looking for and the improvements that we're hoping to make in the communities, those are still going to stay static.
I'm glad you mentioned other states. Are there other states that have done things that you're jealous of or that you would like to replicate?
There are some states that I'm jealous of nobody else. Let them be jealous of Maryland.
Well, I'm thinking, for example,
Yeah.
As some of the participants in this room may know, Michigan recently announced that it was going to scale up its cash grants for pregnant moms and kids program.
The Bridge program, which we're actually bringing to Maryland as well. I mean, and it's one of the things that we really do love is states are the ball game right now. I mean, all the innovation is taking place at the state level because the state is really the place where you can show not just efficacy, but scale. Because if a state can accomplish it and you're then watching how other states are then picking it up, that's how things can actually then become a part of a larger national conversation. But none of us are looking at Washington, D.C. and say, oh, please educate us on how things are supposed to work. That's just not happening right now, right? Especially from this group. So that's actually a great example where we're seeing the level of efficacy with the bridge project, and that's something that we are bringing.
This is the same thing as RX Kids, or?
Yes.
That's what I was referring to. Okay,
yes.
yeah.
Sorry. So RX Kids, the bridge project, but basically making sure we're providing additional assistance to pregnant moms and giving them a better shot at long-term success, because the thing that we continue to know is if you can give a child a better chance at early success, and that both means being able to support the parent and dealing with the issue of childhood poverty, but also where does education come into that for both the child and the parent? Where does transportation come into that? And so making sure we're building an entire ecosystem around that. So there are some innovative things that I think are happening within other states that we're looking at, the same way that we have other states now. Just for example, this past weekend, I was with Mikey Sherrill, who's running for governor of New Jersey, hopefully New Jersey's next governor, who announced that as she becomes the governor of New Jersey, that she is going to introduce the Enough Act in terms of her budget and get it done inside of New Jersey. So we really believe that states become the laboratories of really innovative ideas, and why I think it is an exciting time to for state government.
One of the issues that often comes up with the child tax credit and its administration is that if you have a baby on January 1st of this year, you won't be eligible for the child tax credit until next year, with the exception of course, the brief experiment that we had through the American Rescue Plan.
With the current structuring of it, yes.
Yes, the current structuring of it.
Yeah.
Is that something that you are looking into, pulling forward payments? How difficult administratively is it for a state to do that? I mean, presumably you have the infrastructure set up to give payments out through the tax system once a year, but I don't know how hard it is to, or even if this is an issue you're interested in addressing.
It definitely is, and I do think that part of the beauty of a child tax credit or many of these other policies is that they can be living documents and iterative, because I don't think that was I think that was an oversight when it was initially pulled together. But it is something that we're actually able to help to address. And, one of the nice things about our state is that because we have like-minded people, for example, our comptroller, who's a like-minded soul on this, that we can do a better job when it comes to thinking through not only is the structure correct on the CTC, but then also are we making sure that people are actually taking it and actually utilizing it? Because one of the biggest challenges we have within our state was you could adjust the policy, but if people don't know about that, and if it was complicated for people to take on, then congratulations, you passed a law, but it's not going to be a law that anyone's actually benefiting from. And so it is one of the things that we are actually working in concert with both our comptroller and also our local elected officials to make sure that the word is out, that it can be easier for people to be able to process and take on. It's the same reason we're also now utilizing technologies in a different kind of way, because I mean, part of the beauty of technology. So for example, we now have, essentially a one-stop access platform utilizing technology for all benefits, because the challenge was that for so many people, if you qualified for a certain benefit, you probably qualified for others. You just didn't know it because they forced you to go through the same process over and over and over. It's like, okay, remind me again of your poverty. Remind me again of your poverty. Go ahead and find this paperwork that you might have lost. Go ahead and remind me about the complexity of your situation. Versus it's like, no, there should be a one-stop for people who be able to process their benefits and be able to receive and support them. And so we saw that was a challenge for us. And so we actually then utilized technology and said, let's go ahead and build it. So now Maryland actually has a one-step processing platform that frankly, wealthy people use all the time. So now we're just saying, let's actually democratize technology to be able to benefit everybody for the benefits that they need and deserve and qualify for. So it is something I think having like-minded people who you're working with is extremely helpful in terms of actually dealing with those kind of gaps in the system.
That brings me to another thing that I wanted to ask you about, which has been a big debate within, I think, the social welfare community and the left writ large in particular, about the question of universality versus means testing for benefits like whether it's the child tax credit or healthcare or various other kinds of programs. SNAP, yes.
Yep.
And there are obviously pros and cons to both. You have less of an administrative burden if everybody qualifies. It's much more expensive if everybody qualifies. Maybe you have less of a stigma if everybody qualifies. So where do you come down if I don't know if this is something you've grappled with yourself, but clearly this has been a big debate for the last few years within the Democratic Party and again within the sort of social welfare research community as well.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty clear on it. It's like, I don't understand why we would put together policies and platforms that we don't have any intention of actually working for people. I mean, and I see that, where it's like we are putting together these initiatives, but then constantly creating loopholes and barriers. And listen, I think the country is about to have a very rude awakening, for example, on November 2nd, when these work qualifications start kicking in. And I just think that, and the thing that does get me about it is, and sometimes I'll have this debate with other governors, and whether they are Democratic governors, Republican governors. My peers just selected me to be the new vice chair of the National Governor Association, so I'm the chair-elect of the National Governor Association. So I work with Democratic and Republican governors consistently. And the thing I sometimes like to tell my Republican colleagues is, guys, is this going to impact Maryland? What happens when we continue to add even more barriers now for access to supports? 100% it's going to impact us, right? We're about to watch children who are about to lose food assistance. We're about to watch people lose their health care. But you know who it's really going to hurt? Ohio, Oklahoma, Georgia, Louisiana. So it's like, I think it's really important for people to remember that these systems, if we don't have an intention of building systems that actually work for people, then what are we doing in the first place? And I think that these ties between the federal side and our states, and the fact that we have watched the relationship between our federal government and our states, essentially, it's not even altered, it's severed. That it's the governors, and it's the local elected officials, and it's the people who are on the ground who are going to have to get really creative and really thoughtful about opening up the aperture and making it easier, or else you're going to have a lot of people who are going to feel a lot of pain, and it's going to be completely unnecessary and unwarranted, and frankly, just deeply cruel, what's about to happen to so many people in our communities.
So what does that actually mean in the context of something like cash grants? Is it better to push for universal cash grants for kids so that there are no barriers, essentially, or at least minimal barriers because everybody qualifies, but it's a lot more expensive?
Yeah.
Or to try to target them to the families that are the neediest, including, kids who are in poverty or deep poverty,
Yeah.
and exclude those who are above some income threshold. I mean, I think saying, yes, why are we designing things that don't work? Obviously, nobody's going to disagree with, well, maybe a few people will disagree with that. But for the most part, people are going to say, yes, obviously we should design policies that actually work. Otherwise, why are we doing them? But the question is, for this specific idea that we are all gathered to talk about, what is the right route for it, particularly if we're talking, I know you're obviously the governor of a state, but there's a national dialogue about this as well, and it's a lot more expensive to say everybody gets this expanded child tax credit rather than targeting it at those who are lowest income.
Yeah, no, so one, I think we do need to make sure that we are focusing on where the heaviest levels of needs are, and so I don't have a problem with that. In fact, I think we need to continue following the data, following the research, and say what is going to be the most impactful. And frankly, for the ones who are in the deepest levels of need, that is where it's going to be the most impactful. So I do think we have to be able to start there at our baseline. The challenge though that I do have is when we're having the conversation about who receives the benefits and who doesn't. How are we thinking about allocation and not? I feel like it also helps to fall into a narrative trap. And there is this otherism that then takes place when it comes to basic supports. And so, yes, we have to make sure we're targeting our supports. Yes, we have to make sure we're focusing on things that we have the highest probability of, again, not just being effective, but being scalable. Yes, we have to focus on the things that are going to be sustainable. And yes, we have to live within a certain financial means. I'm really careful and really cautious about how we are navigating this in this moment and the language around it, where it does not feel like this is what are we doing to help those people? Because I think it's the fastest way to end up watching a complete unraveling of a measure of supports that I think are not just justified, but important.
There has been some interest among Republicans in programs like, universal child allowances or cash grants. We haven't seen it so much in congressional votes recently. But there's certainly been some discussion of it, and even, I mentioned Michigan. There are some champions in Michigan, very pro-life, very conservative lawmakers who are also on board with an initiative that is otherwise mostly championed by Democrats. What can be done, if it's even important to do so, to bring more Republicans into the fold for this? Are there particular design elements or language that should be used so that programs like child allowances and general child poverty reduction can get more purchase among Republicans?
Yeah. You mean things like, what's the new thing, Trump bonds?
Trump accounts, yeah.
Trump accounts. So actually, I think there is. And so, for example, I think about the Enough Act, where I remember when we were first having this conversation around, we need to make sure we're addressing the issue of childhood poverty and concentrated childhood poverty. And there's a few things that were really important, I think, in terms of helping to get it passed. And first, let me say, shout out to our team in the state of Maryland, and who I know many of them are here now. Carmel, Johnny, Francesca, Kelsey, the whole team. It's dark, so I can't see where they actually are right now. But the whole team around it, many of whom were trained here, by the way. But initially, when we were talking about it, people were basically like, "Oh yeah, you mean Baltimore?" It's like, no, I don't just mean Baltimore, guys. I mean, if you look at the map of Maryland, there was really two heartbreaking things that if you looked at the map of where child poverty exists in the state of Maryland. One was that if you looked at the map in 2023, it looked exactly the same as the map in 2013 and exactly the map in 2003. It's the same communities. The only difference is that the red areas are in redder, right? The other thing that we show when you look at the map of child poverty in Maryland is it's everywhere. It's not just in Baltimore. It's everywhere in the state of Maryland, urban, rural, and suburban. And so we really had to highlight that when we were talking about enough, that enough wasn't just about, urban poverty. Enough was urban, rural, suburban. And it was very intentional that if you look at where our enough communities are laid out, it's 27 different communities across the state of Maryland. And from communities from Western Maryland to the Eastern Shore, to everywhere between. And in many cases, if you're looking at the challenges that our communities in the Eastern Shore were dealing with, they are actually in many ways even more distinct because there's less resources and less support systems. Like, what does it look like when we're trying to address the issue of childhood poverty? Part of the reason that we've done so much work, we've invested in the first hospital in the Eastern Shore, the University of Maryland Regional Shore Hospital, that the Eastern Shore is going to cover down on 6 different jurisdictions, that the Eastern Shore has now had in 2 generations, first hospital that has been built out, because not even to get specialized care, to get basic care, you literally had to travel upwards of an hour and a half to 2 hours to get basic care, to be out there. That we had, if you look at broadband access, the reason we focus on broadband access to now in Maryland, we are 99.5% of our state is now fully covered in broadband access. We will have the entire state covered by 2027. It is a pledge that we made because, you know what having broadband access now does? It then opens up the access to things like telehealth and educational supports. And so the reason I say that, and the reason I bring that up is just for this reason, that some of the greatest champions that we had for enough were actually rural lawmakers who said, I like this, and this is going to help my community. And the reason is because they saw, but we had to make the case. This is not just helping Baltimore. It's helping my community too.
When you say Baltimore and urban.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a very coded air quotes that I was doing there. Yeah.
Is some of the project for getting more Republicans on board about making clear that this is not only about non-white communities?
Yes, 100%. Because listen, and I think there is this there's this deep and dark narrative, and frankly, deep and dark history in our state and in this country about what poverty looks like, who the takers are, who are the ones that consistently, are asking. And so there is no doubt, and I don't think anybody can argue, that oftentimes when we're having this conversation about what does it mean to have sustainable economic mobility and build, that it's coded. And I think that it was one of the things that we really wanted to address with Enough as well. And part of the reason that Enough wasn't, part of the reason that I think the beauty of the model is that it's not top-down, is what we're also doing is highlighting to all of our communities and neighborhoods that, like, our communities don't need us to come save them, right? We're not the white knights who are just coming in and, like, freeing you all of your, lifting the veil of ignorance over your eyes. We're not there to save our communities. We're trying to stop punishing them. We're trying to stop putting policies that are hurting them. Because that, in many cases, is what our communities are continuing to deal with. Again, urban, rural, and suburban communities. That these are the communities that have been left behind. These are the communities that have not been a part of the conversation, that they have been subjects of the conversation, but they've never been a part of the conversation. And so I do think that part of this work is it's not just about the work that we're doing to uplift communities, uplift neighborhoods, but frankly, it's frankly to remove this veil of ignorance that society oftentimes happens about who are the deserving poor and who are the ones that need and deserve support.
I think this also gets back to my earlier question about universality, right? That if you have a means-tested program, which in many ways is more manageable because it is less expensive, there is the risk of stigma and of creating sort of a marketing campaign around this is just the undeserving poor who are getting this money, as opposed to the deserving poor or everyone else, and you may have less have a weaker political coalition, right, for the program.
True, but I also believe, but if you don't do it, you're going to run the risk of people making the argument, then let's just do nothing. We can't afford that now. We'll deal with that later. And so I do think that, I think that's absolutely right on many frames, right? But I believe that we have to be able to lead with data. We have to be able to lead with urgency and empathy. And I think especially when it comes to the issue of child poverty, and part of the argument that we had to make to the people of our communities and the people of the state of Maryland is that, guys, whether you realize it or not, it's everywhere. And we've got to come up with a plan of being able to target it and saying that, because we're not going to get to X part in part of an initial round does not become the excuse for why we're just going to sit on our hands and say there's got to be a better time than now.
I asked about bringing in more Republicans to the fold. I also wonder about Democrats' resistance to potentially work with Republicans on these issues. Earlier this year, Donald Trump was asked about a $5,000 baby bonus, and he was subject to a lot of mockery from the left, from left-wing media, about, well, of course, like, $5,000 won't do anything to help people afford a baby. Babies are way more expensive than that. But if you had framed the question a little bit differently, it sounded a lot like Kamala Harris's proposal, which Democrats were on board with last year. I found this endlessly frustrating. Like, peel away who's proposing the idea, if it's a good idea, in some fashion. And I don't know that however Donald Trump would have laid it out would have been the right way. There was very little detail. But I wonder, given this political environment where there is so much partisan internal processing of ideas, how do you break through with your own side as well?
Yeah, listen, it's a very good and fair question. Like, now I will say, I think part of the mockery that we saw around Donald Trump proposing that wasn't even just the policy per se, because listen, anybody who was talking about being able to support families and support children and support children growing poverty, like I'm here for it, right? I'm here for it. I just find it. I think where the mockery came from is it's not the cynicism is not at all lost to me. On the same bill where you introduce something to say I'm going to support children in poverty, you're also kicking them off of health care. Like I can't get over that. I can't get over the fact that you're saying we want to uplift children from poverty, and you're also having the largest upward consolidation of wealth in world history. So that is, I think, more the mockery, where there's just it's just deeply disingenuous. If you say I really want to uplift children, but you are literally going to take away supports for their parents, you're going to take away their health care, you're going to drive up premiums, but I'm really here for the kids. Like,
Well, to be fair, I think when he was asked about this, it was a pronatalism thing. It was about maybe we can help people have, we can encourage people to have more kids, which is a different framing than lifting kids out of poverty.
But
if it's the same mechanism and it can help kids,
Correct.
I guess my question is why not
Yeah.
say, sure, don't
Correct.
threaten me with a good time,
Yes.
basically.
And I don't want to lose your question, and I want to answer because it is a very important question, and it is something that I think we have really pushed to do within our state. Now we're looking at, I think the number is now 98% of every bill that we have introduced in the state of Maryland has been passed bipartisan in the state of Maryland. So we've modeled that behavior. That the Enough Act was passed with both Democrat and Republican support. Mm-hmm. We've modeled that behavior. I do believe deeply that there can and there should be bipartisan supports for issues like child poverty and issues that we care about. I'm proud of the fact that when I announced I was running for re-election a couple weeks ago, some of the first people that came out to endorse me there was a whole series of Republican lawmakers, mayors, local leaders, who were some of the first ones to come out and say, listen, I might not agree with the governor on everything, but he shows up and he builds a table big enough for all of us. So he's got my support for re-election. And so I do think that type of behavior does model itself. I just think that there has to be an intellectual consistency about what policies are we putting in place that are actually going to help our children and help the families that they're growing up in.
And then my last question to you, you've sort of segued into in a way, which is there is a lot of friction between the two parties. And one way we are seeing that manifest right now is this fight over gerrymandering in other states, particularly in Republican states where there is unilateral Republican control. There is an effort to basically gerrymander seats away from Democrats. There has been pressure put on you and on Governor Pritzker in Illinois because you are two states with unified Democratic control to redraw the map so that it favors Democrats. There's been some reporting recently that House Leader Hakeem Jeffries has been pressuring you to sign on board to this. Would you care to share any of your thoughts about where your thinking is on this issue, particularly if you are trying to continue working with Republicans in your own state?
Yeah. Well, one, I say that no one pressures me.
Fair.
That I don't, and folks know I don't respond to that. I mean, I'm going to do what I always believe is best for the folks of my state.
Well, what do you think is best for the folks of your state?
I think we need to have fair maps. And I think that right now, if you look at this country, you have less than 10% of all congressional districts are competitive. The country right now is gerrymandered. Less than 10% of all our congressional seats are competitive. You have congressional leaders who are running for re-election who will win by 30 and 40 and 50 points. That's a fair map. So my only thing is this, is that I can't stand gerrymandering. I can't stand the fact that we do have a system of elections where you have politicians choosing their people and not people choosing their politicians, right? And I can't stand the fact that people, let's not, people should not say, I can't believe this is happening. I'm sorry, what world are you living in right now? Less than 10% of all congressional seats are competitive. So my only point is this, is that Donald Trump cannot sit there and pick and choose what states should have fair maps. That Donald Trump cannot sit there and say, you know what, Indiana, Texas, you all should have fair maps. The rest of you sit on your hands. And it just sounds very similar to what happened in Georgia, where he was calling up election officials and saying, I need you to find me votes. Like, what is going on right now is a travesty. It's a travesty to our democracy. It's a travesty to our people. And my only point is this, is that Donald Trump should not be the judge and juror over who has fair maps and who doesn't. So if you are having these other states that are having conversations about fair maps, then I'm very clear, so will Maryland. And we will make sure that we have fair maps in our state too.
What does fair, just to define your terms, is a fair map one where the voters choose their politicians, or is there a fair map one where Democrats do the same thing that Republicans are doing in other states?
No, I don't, no, there is no objective that I would have on saying that, oh, we need to have an 8-0 map, right? But I will say that we need to have fair maps.
On that note, thank you again to our governor, and thank you all for attending. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
So no conference can go off with 0 hitches, and we will have CC Rouse joining us just a little bit late. She'll just scoot on in. There's a little traffic issue, I think. But Doug has assured me that he has riveting comments that will all be spellbound, so it's okay. I will go ahead and give just a very brief introduction of both CC and Doug to start off. So the Council of Economic Advisors is one of the things that binds these two speakers. The purpose of the council is to give advice to the administration on a wide range of issues. They've both chaired the CEA, representing 4 different administrations. They both had 2 terms on the council. They also, while they were chair of the CEA, oversaw broad expansions to the child tax credit. During 2001, Doug chaired the CEA during the Bush tax cuts that doubled the child tax credit from $500 to $1,000, and the credit became partially refundable for the first time. During 2021, Cecilia chaired the CAA when the child tax credit was made fully refundable temporarily. Now, they are still bound in biography because they preside over research organizations that are effective at developing policies. So I think they offer us some lessons from the inside and some lessons on the outside. And I'm really excited. So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I'm going to start off with a question to just sort of help us understand, like, what is the CEA? What does it do? Like, when you were there, can you talk about, like, how do you generate information, use information from other places, and, you know, sort of play offense and defense on policy development?
Thanks for the chance to be here, and I'm pleased to have a chance to talk about the CEA. Most people will know it was created by the Employment Act of 1946. So it created the Joint Economic Committee and the CEA, so these 2 bodies that were to advise the Hill and the White House respectively on economic issues. The act specified there would be 3 PhD economists available to the White House, and the White House didn't ask for this; it was sort of jammed in there. And consistent with its academic roots, it couldn't function at first because no one was in charge. There were 3 co-equals, and so they had to amend things to provide for a chair and members. And given its sort of strange location, jammed into the White House, I think one of the things to remember about the CEA is it's as good as the relationship between the chair and the president. And that's a crucial aspect of being able to influence what you get done at the CEA. So in terms of how, what you do when you go there, I mean, it was one of the most important moments in my career. So I had gotten a PhD at Princeton, and in the grand tradition of the PhD programs, they created a mini-me and sent me off to Columbia to teach. And then Columbia in 1985 was not in the best neighborhood. It's the largest open-air drug market in the Western Hemisphere. And any 18-year-old who went there had a lot of self-confidence. And so they were not particularly interested in anything I had to say, as near as I could tell. So I taught there for 3 years, and I was publishing papers in obscure journals that no real people read. I genuinely had a crisis of confidence. I thought, maybe I'm just wasting my life doing this. So in a crisis, you always go home, and I went back to Princeton, and while I was there, John Taylor and Harvey Rosen, two of the important mentors in my career, both headed off to the George H.W. Bush administration. Harvey went to Treasury, John went to CEA, and John said, why don't you come along and be a senior economist? And so I went to the CEA, convinced that I was going to do something real, make a difference in the real world, not be this sort of pointy-headed academic, doing something pointless. And to my utter surprise, two things happened. Number one, I spent all of my time teaching economics. And it was a different setting, but this was a Republican White House, and to my astonishment, they were happy to put their fingers on everything under the sun. So I sort of felt like I was doing an oral version of, free to choose. Like, don't touch that. I mean, everything's fine. Markets work. But it really was, this was a chance to educate people about sort of how the economy worked, and that was satisfying. I enjoyed the teaching. To me, economics has always been an incredibly useful way to organize my thinking about the world, and sort of telling people how to do that was valuable. The second thing, which was really important to the research community, everyone sitting in this audience, I found out people could and did say anything in the pursuit of their preferred policy. I mean, if you can just get the capital gains rates at 10%, then we no more teenage pregnancy, we're good, I'd be like, wait a minute. And so the only check on that process really was the large body of policy research out there. It doesn't give you the answer, but it says that's not going to happen, right? I mean, you can rule out a whole lot. And most of what the CEA does is marshal the whole body of work. They call a lot of people for help, things like that, in order to kill bad ideas. 90% of what you do is killing bad ideas, which is really important to remember when you see the things that actually get adopted sometimes. The bads, honestly, I've had this moment several times. Like, oh my God, that one made it out. What didn't? So that's what the CEA does. And then you get involved in developing policy. State of the Union is going to come, so you sit in on these interagency working groups and develop policy, develop the economic forecast that underlies the president's budget, in general, you have those are the main tasks. You write the economic report of the president. It's the only statutory responsibility of the CEA, and then the rest is all firefighting on the president's agenda. Something happens 24/7. The question is, how does this affect the president's agenda? And one of the things about White Houses is, everybody's the enemy. That includes Capitol Hill, even if it's controlled by your party. They don't understand. And so you're just trying to promote the president's agenda all the time.
I love that you brought up that much of your job at the CEA is like tamping down bad ideas.
Yes.
Because I often describe my job the same way. Why don't we try this tax credit to do something crazy? And I'm like, why don't we do not that?
Yeah.
So I wanted to.
There should be a permanent memo called "Not That."
Yeah,
Just leave
not
it.
that. Let's have bigger dreams or change our dreams. So I want to go to the child tax credit.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think many people know it started in 1997 under President Clinton. $400 non-refundable, quickly became $500, and then sat there for quite some time. And when it was introduced, the president said this was a middle-class tax break. It was intended to make it so that middle-class families could afford being parents. And, it was swimming along, but a few people noticed there were some holes in this and that it could be improved. Along comes your time. It moves from a $500 middle-class benefit to a $1,000 benefit. And importantly, for people who are very interested in what's happening with low-income families, it became partially refundable. It started out as temporary policy, but ended up being made permanent. And in some ways, it put us down this path of making the credit more available to low-income families. So then we have the ARPA expansions, which I'm going to wait for Cece to talk about. And then we come to today, where the One Big Beautiful Bill Act comes in. The maximum child tax credit goes from $2,000 per child up to $2,200 per child. But unlike the changes that happened in 2021, the One Big Beautiful Bill maintained everything about the phase-in. And so for very low income and moderate families, their credits didn't change, but the credit did change for middle and high income families. And also, you know, it's now indexed, which I think a lot of people would say is good policy. And so I'm curious about your thoughts. Does the version of the child tax credit we have now, is that the right child tax credit? Or should we keep on tinkering with it and make some changes? What sort of changes would you make? Or what do you like about what we have now?
So let me say a couple of things to avoid really answering the question.
I've been taking notes from Catherine Rappel, though.
So all CEAs are different, and here's why I bring it up. When I was at the CEA with George H.W. Bush, that was Andrews Air Force Base negotiations over the deficit. He ultimately was, agreed to some tax increases, which cost him politically, and that CEA was obsessed with budgetary outlook and things like ground urban haulings and that. The CEA I arrived at in 2001, the Clinton administration had balanced the budget, and it was a very different environment. And indeed, W was elected as a kinder, gentler Republican, I don't know if people can remember that, who was largely interested in the domestic policy agenda. No Child Left Behind was the premier piece, but not far behind was this. And so the expansion of the credit had a lot of support from like the Domestic Policy Council. Margaret, who's now heading the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I was terrified of her. So, and very significantly, Karl Rove thought it was good politically. So, I mean, that carried an enormous weight in that. For those who've never worked with Karl Rove, he is one of the most data-driven people you'll ever meet. Like, you think of these as a political strategist, somehow not an empiricist, but he is just driven by the data. And he was convinced this would be a good idea. So there was that faction that wanted to really just do things. And the CEA as a whole, and just to clarify that, I was the chief economist, Glenn Hubbard was the chair. So, okay. But we were trying to keep them from spending every dime and running big deficits again, because we did the Medicare Modernization Act that started as a $25 billion senior helping hand program and was 8 times bigger the time it got done. No, more than that. And so it was just huge. So we were very much against the expansion at first. We really were. But ultimately, to get the 2001 tax cuts through, they needed to recruit some Democrats. This was an effective way to do it, and that's how it got done.
Makes sense. I think it's interesting you brought up financing and how important that is.
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate that you have your eye on that. So separate from the design of the program in 2021 or the merits of a more or less robust child allowance, my read of your objections to the most recent expansions in 2021 mostly were focused on how the program was funded. The notion that the 2021 expansions could be made permanent through higher corporate taxes, for example, I think you were not super fond of.
Not a fan. True.
Could you talk a bit about how you think about funding a program like this and what kinds of revenue streams and policy design considerations we should have in mind when thinking about future expansions? So I'm trying to pick up on earlier conversations here where the research panel talked about how when we deliver $1 of benefits to kids, we get $1 later on in savings, sometimes much more than that, up to $10. And so, I'm sort of like, it seems like a good investment to me. But you're,
So I was deeply concerned about the financing because, you know, the stark reality is we run very large deficits and we have an impending fiscal problem that, quite frankly, scares me, and which I think is so deeply unfair to the next generations. It's just almost, it's criminal. And so we spend, I forget what it is, $8 on seniors for every dollar we spend on kids. I want to change that. You want to finance it? Take it from those programs somewhere, put it in the kids' programs. Don't expand the deficit. And I thought the 2017 Act was a really powerful business tax reform. Had some other problems, it wasn't so great. But we were losing 5 headquarters of U.S. companies every year for 5 years leading up to the 17. We passed that and made ourselves internationally tax competitive. We haven't lost a headquarters since. The one company that was leaving during the deliberation came back. So I don't really want to jack that back up. I think that would be a mistake. So I want spending offsets. I prefer to do it in old age programs and try to rebalance how we support the population.
got it. So this is, another way to finance programs is to simplify them. Maybe combine different programs.
Oh, please.
And,
That'll
yeah,
happen.
economists always say, make it simpler. I've had a lot of talks with Gene Sturley over the year where he says during tax reform, everyone went in and they wanted an efficient system. They wanted something that was fair and they wanted simple, you know, all this. And at the end of the day, all the arguments for simplification were like, it's not that important. Just shove it under the desk and focus on
Yes.
revenues and everything else. So
Have you read Section 199A of the tax code?
no. No, I have not. And so I wonder, do you think at all about, you know, we have an earned income tax credit, we have a child
Yes.
tax credit, we have premium tax credits that go to support families with children. We have a SNAP program, we have a WIC program, we have education tax
yes.
credits. This is a lot
Yes.
of complexity.
Yes.
And how would you think about that?
First of all, do you know why we have it as a tax credit? Because there were caps on discretionary spending that were a key part of balancing the budget. So to get the money out, they had to do it as a tax credit. And this is just an aside, but as an aside, it's one of the things that really helped ruin the IRS, because the IRS was a premier agency at collecting money, and it's a terrible agency for sending money. And we started asking it to do things it was not prepared to do. And we've done it increasingly. And I really think we have other people who know how to send checks. So Social Security can send checks really, really, really well. They should just do it.
I hear that. But Social Security doesn't have current information on children. They, you know, IRS did a pretty stand-up job in 2021 when they were delivering monthly payments. I told a lot of people that's crazy. They can never do it. They did it.
Agreed.
And now they're delivering 30% of aid to families with children. That's a lot.
I know. Anyway.
So how would you consolidate
They're not collecting
benefits?
enough taxes is the problem.
So
So I think for me, the most important pieces of this credit are getting it to very low income households. And targeting more effectively for me is the number one priority. We simply don't have the resources to do everything we want. So where do we make those choices? I say target it on the lowest income, make it refundable. I don't think it's a middle class tax credit. I don't think it should be juiced up at the upper end. I really think it goes too high in the income distribution. We ought to really focus it. And, you know, I think this one and the earned income tax credit are the priorities. The rest are lessers in my mind.
And because the EITC and CTC do a good job of what they're trying to do, they're better than the child care credit, the education credits, those sorts of things?
I don't think we're getting much from the education credits. I mean, we aren't doing very much in K-12 education either, so that's not great. So yeah, I just think, you know, simplification is important. Fewer tax credit and spending programs are going to be key going forward. Got to make some choices.
All right. We're admittedly going off script here.
There was no script. I was not given a script.
So when I think of simplification, which I agree with, there's part of it is what you're talking about, getting rid of benefits that aren't working, making a smaller set of benefits. But there's another piece of simplification that I think was, sort of brought up in earlier panels, the administrative issues. And we have a difficult time in the tax system figuring out where kids belong.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of avenues for simplification that we could think about. Instead of this, how many nights did you spend in this house versus another house, those sorts of rules. Do you think there is opportunity to simplify sort of claiming rules, or that's just a political dead end? And I don't necessarily mean like this week or next week. I know we're in a difficult situation right now, but sort of in the near term.
That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that one. I don't have a vision for how you get there, because it's one of these places where the agenda, which is about the child, gets confounded with the agenda some Republicans have about the family. And if you start dictating who belongs to the family, they get all juiced up. And that's been very hard to figure out.
And what about...
And I don't have a good solution for it. I really don't.
Well, we'll write some more papers.
Yes. I mean, you're at least a research institute. I'm an over 21 daycare center. It's just...
What about the idea of splitting the earned income tax credit into a worker credit, divorce it from families, and expanding the child tax credit to sort of, it would be bigger. It would have the benefits of the EITC and the CTC. Is this just moving deck chairs on the Titanic for you, or?
It is some of that, but it also gets, it poorly targets the EITC, which should be targeted on low-income households, not low-wage workers who might live in very good, affluent households. And so if you break it into the worker credit, you run into that, and we would find ourselves unhappy. So I believe we're doing a reasonably good job there now. It's not ideal. I'm not going to break it.
Don't break it.
Yeah.
We did estimates at the Urban Institute. We've done them a few times where we break out the worker and child credit piece, and roughly 25% goes to exactly who you're talking about, low-wage workers and high-income families. Right. And so that
It's the same reason the minimum wage doesn't really do much for poverty, per se. It's not targetable. Right.
So you talk a lot about the coming budget crisis. I think you attach
Not
it.
coming. Here. No, I mean, we're paying for this every day, right? I mean, the crowding out is real. The lack of flexibility in the budget is real. The fact that we can't, I mean, the best example which I always give is my daughter is all in for a paid family leave program in the United States, but the money's all spoken for by programs from 1965, so we can't do it. And that's not okay in a representative democracy. Younger voters should be able to get something they want. Hi.
I'd show up.
I'm Doug. I'm talking to this woman.
I'll just listen, Doug.
No, you won't.
Excellent. So we have covered the ground of how the child tax credit started, how it is now, the initial expansion from $500 to $1,000. And what I would really like to hear from you is sort of digging into the 2021 expansion. So a lot of people in this room are quite familiar. It was the genesis in some ways of this project, but there were a lot of moving pieces, right? Very young children got a credit boost from a maximum of $2,000 to up to $3,600. 6 to 17-year-olds went up to $3,000. A big but maybe unnoticed expansion was we included 17-year-olds for the first time, so big gains there. The credit was fully refundable, and by that we meant that even the very lowest income families received the credit even if they were not working. We heard earlier that there's roughly a third of children who don't get the maximum child tax credit just because their parents don't earn enough. And then on top of that, which are all these big structural things, you also oversaw it becoming a monthly tax credit. So at this point, for 6 months, it really looked a lot like transfer program, more so than a tax credit. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on what were the highlights, what were the lowlights, what do we walk away with, like what's our target for the future? And that's a lot. But Doug's had a lot of time to talk, so you can.
I know, and I didn't have the benefit of hearing what he said, but it's nice to be here. Okay, so highlights. You know, we were in the middle of a pandemic. I think many people were worried about welfare and, welfare. Okay, we understand that. About individual welfare. If we're powering down the economy, how are people going to pay rent, et cetera? And so, look, I wasn't there at the very beginning of this, but it was looking for opportunities for, to get more assistance in many different vehicles that we had available. And, you know, obviously there was, people who are very inclined towards the child tax credit in power. And so looking for the opportunity to really help low-income families in a way that we hadn't done before. And I'm referring to the full refundability. And then there's a sense, we'll get into what I thought some of the lowlight were. It went up fairly high, in my opinion, up the income distribution to be assisting, better off, I don't want to call them wealthy, better off families as well. And so the highlights was we did, what we did for child poverty, which everybody here estimated. We were looking at, calling up the Columbia folks and, what has this done? What are your simulations telling us, right? We had a significant reduction in child poverty. I think that was a huge accomplishment, showing that it's possible to do this. I don't know if you had the conversation of what the impacts might have been on labor supply. We don't think it was very large. And so this was, it's demonstrated it was a way to significantly increase the material, well-being for families with young children. So that's highlight. Low light is I think it was a little too generous. So in the rooms, I think that the full refundability was important. I thought that was more important than going up higher on the income distribution. And so, but when you try to do both, it gets expensive, which made it a bit of a target in an administration that was, in hindsight, looks really fiscally responsible in comparison. It's all relative. But nonetheless, we had those conversations and in terms of what the trade-offs were. So, do I wish it were more generous today than do I need it to have been as generous as during the American Rescue Plan? No. I think it would, but I wish that we're still fully refundable.
So there's a pretty robust debate about how to deliver the credit, monthly versus annual. There's a large body of research that shows when people get large tax refunds, some important things happen. If you have a college-age kid in the house or an older high school student, there's work out there that shows you're more likely to enroll in college. There is plenty of work out there that says you get the big refund, you can do mobility-enhancing activities, you can put a down payment on a new apartment, you can buy a used car, you can buy a refrigerator. All of these, seem like very noble things. And then there's also, a discussion that, people have monthly needs. They're living on a knife's edge. They're taking payday loans. They're paying enormous amounts of money to get their tax refund faster. And so that sort of cuts into the, maybe we ought to deliver this thing monthly. And I am interested in both of your thoughts about this annual versus monthly program.
Go ahead.
No, I've been talking for.
I think you've laid out a lot of the pros and cons. I think that, look, I don't do the politics, but there was also a discussion of if we give people the monthly benefit, then they're getting that, on a more regular basis. They can really count on it. They don't have to wait till the end of the year. On the other hand, it cut down on the salience. So it was just something that they were getting in their bank account. They were getting it every month. And I think the Biden administration got very little political credit for it. I don't know I haven't seen the evidence on whether it made a difference for families to receive it on a monthly basis. It was a huge lift for Treasury to be able to pull that off. Larry Summers, I think, complained, like, if they were doing that instead of focusing on other things, like, because that diverted resources. Like, let's be real, implementation matters for this. And so I don't know if you did a full accounting for whether getting what we accomplished by giving it monthly, because there were a lot of other resources that were going to families, but we were worried about families that were credit constrained, and for which having the smooth injection would make a difference. But I haven't looked to see sort of on net whether the benefits of doing that outweighed the costs.
And one
So
thing you mentioned
another-
earlier is how good Social Security is at delivering checks, and they do it monthly.
Yeah.
So,
So I think it interacts with the sort of nature of the design in the following way. So a feature of the Affordable Care Act, as it was originally enacted, came out, that troubled me, was the fact that where they drew the line between the Medicaid expansion and the ACA, many people transited that line once, often twice in a year. So they're bouncing on and off the premium tax credits, on and off the ACA exchanges. They're changing their providers at the same time. It's actually impairing the quality of the healthcare that's being delivered. And, that just seemed like a problem to me. I don't know what the volatility looks like in this, and I haven't seen anything on that. Where if you deliver it monthly, do you just say, okay, we make a determination at the beginning of the year, we deliver it the same amount monthly no matter what happens to them? That might be a practical reality that you need to just accept. But, how much of a problem is that going to be when you start, getting into the politics? Someone says, well, this person's not supposed to be getting this, they're making too much money. So I think a little bit about that. And then, it also depends how quickly you phase it out and things like that.
and I think that's a lot of the issue when you have this credit that goes to, nearly every child in the country, 90% of families, then you got to believe that some families, it's going to hit differently than other families.
I think the understanding, but I could be wrong. I'm sure there are people here who could answer this better. But I think the view was they were going to make the determination of eligibility once and just spread it over the year, as opposed to
That's what I would do.
Yeah,
Correct.
as
I just- the
opposed to
question is
having made
that-
it a
yeah.
monthly adjudication, so that they're not going.
Yeah, but my question is, we only saw it for a year, but if it was around for a while, would it acquire this reputation of giving money to people who didn't deserve it?
Well,
You worry about that.
yeah, absolutely.
Right, and in a pandemic, you have the political capital to have a hold harmless.
Yeah.
So when you're very low income, it's okay if you end up making extra money, that's fine, you can keep the credit, but
Yeah,
that can become costly.
exactly.
So we've heard in other sessions today about the ongoing generation of new evidence about how income supports benefit children over their lifetimes, and particularly low-income children. They're good investments. We've also heard about the momentum at the state level to complement and fill in the gaps from cuts at the federal level. With all this in mind, could you speak a little bit, and I'll ask Cecilia first, if anything, what is feasible in the near or long term when it comes to child benefits? Is there more to be done? Are we just stuck with what we have? Should we be giving up at the federal level and just doubling down at the states? How do we think about, these investments of kids? Where are you thinking about it?
Well, I think the states are always a good laboratory to be experimenting in, and for us and that's where we see a lot of innovation when it comes to all manner of policy, and I think that this would be one here. I think that our fertility situation and the fact that it's so expensive to raise children is where you will see some push to make it and help families be able to afford to have children, because our declining fertility rate is going to be rather concerning, where we have a rising dependency ratio, and that's going to affect our productivity in the medium and longer term. And when there are many people have put up different hypotheses for why we see fertility dropping, but one of the reasons is the cost of childcare, of raising a child. And so I think there will be increasing pressure to be helping young families be able to afford, whether it's in terms of their education and daycare, paid sick leave for parents to be able to take care of their kids and not lose their jobs, and some additional cash assistance to make it flat out say we understand. I mean, what is it? I think isn't there a baby bond maybe even in the one big beautiful bill, right? So we're going to be right? That is child assistance. So I don't think it's like a dark day where nothing is going to move here, because I think there's just going to be a demographic need. And if you look at some of the politics, as their politics are, going to be pushing in that direction as well. So I personally think that this is still a time to be thinking innovatively, thinking creatively, because I think that there will be some political need, and I think the states are going to be part of that solution, and I think the federal government may be stepping in as well.
So I think on the child care per se, that the states are the ideal laboratory for that to take place. For just the cash support, I think the politics line up. I mean, there are a lot of conservatives who are very pro-family, are very concerned about the fertility decline. They're going to be all in for a set of reasons that aren't exactly the same as trying to get it to the worse off circumstances for kids. And it is going to be a future with finite resources to do things. So you got to find things that are going to appeal to both sides.
Kids often land in the middle of that sweet spot, so there's maybe some optimistic, future. So I will remind everyone online, if you have questions, feel free to send them in, and they're supposed to magically pop up on my iPad here, though I don't see any right now. So I will go to one more question. So both of you are in the business of leading organizations that produce policy research. And I think there's a lot of researchers out here, and we would be interested in your view on what are you doing to prepare for these moments, either the budget crisis that's here and will stick with us, or anything else.
I forgot my Milton Friedman quote that I rely on all the time in Capitalism and Freedom. And so I'm going to sort of butcher it, but literally has a quote that says, there are periods where it looks like there's a lot of inertia, but our job is, you have to wait for the moment where the politically impossible becomes inevitable. And our job, and people are looking for ideas that are lying around, and our job is to provide those ideas. Because if the ideas aren't lying around and aren't there when the moment arrives, you will have missed the moment. So this is our moment. I mean, I'm excited for this, for our researchers and for people who want to think creatively and boldly. There may be a moment that didn't exist, 6 months ago, 2 years ago, whenever, for various demographic reasons or whatever might come, but you got to have the ideas. And so that's our job. That's your job.
That is your job. The business model at AF's a little different than the traditional think tank. I realized a couple things. Number one, if you lose an election, you're unemployed. And I hadn't really focused on that. And so I had to figure out what I was going to do with myself. And what I realized is that at the White House, the CBO, and on the campaign, you did policy research, policy education, policy options, policy advice, but you did it in a very particular fashion, which is you worked on whatever was happening that day. You don't have the luxury of saying, that's not my area, call me later. You work on what's happening. You have to convey your results in English to non-experts, to non-specialists, and you have to be cognizant of the political lay of the land. CBO by statute is nonpartisan, so you can't get involved there, but everything in the White House is about the president's agenda. Everything on a campaign, well, that's sort of obvious. And I came to the conclusion that I had done that for my political masters. The average American might benefit from that as well. That, an oil will blows up in the Gulf. They haven't been reading white papers on offshore oil production. They're like, okay, what are my options here? And we are unapologetically market oriented in our solutions, and there are people like that. So they can come to us. And so our papers in particular are meant to be digestible. If we write 8 pages, that's War and Peace. Our target audience is a congressional staffer who's not on the committee of jurisdiction, needs to get smart quick. And so it relies on everybody in this room for the deep research and to have those ideas be out there. We're always reading that, being ready to convey what does the literature tell us about what we should do in this thing. And that way, we're part of this, Milton Friedman guerrilla warfare that is policy, right? You get an opportunity and you do it. And try to do it and work in real time.
Excellent. So I think that is an excellent place to end this conversation. There's marching orders for everyone. As I close this event, I want to, of course, thank the Doris Duke Foundation for their support. We are grateful. We feel like we've been able to do a lot of fun research, and we've learned a lot along the way. Thank you to Urban's events teams, communications team, governor affairs team. You are the best at what you do, and we are so grateful here. And I particularly want to thank Greg Otch and Hillary Hoynes for being co-directors of this initiative with me, and also Joe Broadus and Margot Crandall-Hollick, who are at their war station, I believe Margot calls it, in the back. They keep everything running, but more than that, they provided a lot of the substantive background that made the content of this convening what it was today, and so I'm grateful. We're in a policy moment, I think, where a lot of us wake up each day and everything just feels hard. And I will say that looking at this room full of people who are dedicated to thinking about children has been very uplifting for myself. I have a little thing on my computer, and it says there is no future without children. And I think that is a reason why we do this work. And I'm so grateful for everyone who has stuck with us through it. Thank you.